In a glittering ballroom filled with 500 of the world's wealthiest elites, a single father waiter committed an act so audacious it would shatter every unspoken rule of high society. When he crossed that polished marble floor toward the CEO's scarred daughter, the girl everyone whispered about but no one would touch, he had no idea his simple offer to dance would expose a 15-year-old military secret, destroy carefully constructed lies, and prove that sometimes the poorest man in the room is the richest in courage. Stay with me until the very end of this story, and please comment which city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale of unexpected grace has traveled. The Grandview Hotel rose like a crystal palace against the midnight sky, its windows blazing with golden light that spilled onto the manicured gardens below. Inside the grand ballroom, 500 of the nation's most powerful people gathered beneath chandeliers that cost more than most homes, their laughter echoing off marble walls, their jewelry catching the light like captured stars. This was the annual Lane Industries Charity Gala, the social event of the season, where business deals worth billions were sealed with handshakes and champagne toasts, where family legacies were maintained or destroyed between the appetizer and dessert courses. At the head table, positioned on a raised platform that overlooked the glittering crowd, sat Richard Lane. At 62, he was a man who had built an empire from inherited wealth, transforming his father's modest manufacturing company into a global technology conglomerate. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his tuxedo custom-tailored to his still athletic frame, his face showing the kind of distinguished aging that came from expensive skincare and low stress, or at least the appearance of low stress. His eyes, a sharp gray that employees joked could see through lies and balance sheets with equal clarity, surveyed the room with the practiced ease of a man who had hosted this event for 23 consecutive years. But tonight, those eyes kept drifting to his left, where his daughter Clara sat in a midnight blue gown that had cost $12,000 and 3 fittings with a designer who flew in from Milan specifically for the occasion. Clara Lane was 26 years old, and she was drowning in plain sight. She sat with her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap, her face turned slightly to the left, always to the left, positioning the unscarred side toward the crowd. Her dark hair had been arranged by a stylist into an elegant updo that had taken 2 hours to complete, with delicate tendrils framing the right side of her face in what the stylist had called a softening technique. The makeup artist had spent 40 minutes applying specialized foundation and concealer to the left side of her face, using techniques usually reserved for models and actresses, working with products that cost more per ounce than gold. But no amount of makeup could fully hide the scar. It ran from her left temple down across her cheekbone, branching slightly near her jaw like a lightning bolt frozen in flesh. The skin was puckered and discolored, shiny in places where it had healed too tight, rough in others where tissue had formed unevenly. It pulled at the corner of her eye slightly, giving her an expression that some people mistook for anger or sadness, even when she felt neither. The scar was 3 years old now, a souvenir from the night when a drunk driver had run a red light and turned her Mercedes into twisted metal and shattered glass, when her life had split into before and after with the brutal finality of impact. She had survived. Her college roommate, who had been driving, had not. That fact sat in Clara's chest every day like a stone she couldn't cough up, couldn't swallow, couldn't ignore. Around her, the gala continued its glittering performance. The orchestra, a 15-piece ensemble flown in from New York, played selections from a carefully curated playlist designed to be elegant without being boring, sophisticated without being pretentious. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved through the crowd with practiced invisibility, carrying trays of champagne and crystal flutes and hors d'oeuvres that were more art than food. Conversations hummed and buzzed, punctuated by bursts of laughter that sounded rehearsed, performative, designed to be seen as much as heard. Near the bar, a massive structure of polished mahogany and gleaming brass that ran the length of the western wall, a group of young men had gathered. They were the sons of Richard Lane's business partners and competitors, young men in their late 20s and early 30s who had inherited their father's wealth and sense of entitlement without inheriting any of the work ethic or humility that might have made them bearable human beings. They wore their tuxedos with the casual arrogance of people who had never known what it meant to rent clothing, who had never had to check a price tag, who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. Marcus Drummond stood at the center of the group, holding a glass of bourbon that probably cost more than the waiter's weekly salary. He was 31, handsome in the way that expensive gyms and good genetics could make a person handsome, with the kind of smile that made board members nervous and assistants update their resumes. His father owned a chain of luxury hotels across 3 continents, and Marcus had been groomed since childhood to take over the empire with the same enthusiasm one might show for inheriting a dentist's office. He was also, at this particular moment, staring at Clara Lane with an expression that made Richard's hands tighten around his champagne glass. "God, look at her," Marcus said, his voice carrying just far enough to be heard by his friends, but not quite far enough to reach the head table, though he didn't seem particularly concerned either way. "Lane's daughter used to be hot, remember, before the accident." Tyler Preston, heir to a pharmaceutical fortune and Marcus's best friend since boarding school, snickered into his drink. "Dude, I remember. She was in my sister's year at Princeton. Total knockout. Now look at her. Sits there like a gargoyle, probably hasn't smiled since the crash. Can you blame her?" This from Jameson Blackwell, whose venture capital firm had made him a billionaire at 28 despite having never actually built or created anything of value. I mean, who'd want to look at that every morning in the mirror? The laughter that followed was quiet but cruel. The kind of laughter that draws power from shared meanness, from the knowledge that you're part of an exclusive club that gets to decide who deserves dignity and who doesn't. Marcus took another sip of bourbon, his eyes still on Clara. "You know the saddest part? Old Man Lane keeps bringing her to these things like someone's actually going to ask her to dance, like Prince Charming's going to swoop in and fall in love with the monster." He said the last word with exaggerated emphasis, and Tyler nearly choked on his champagne trying to suppress his laughter. "Someone should tell him," Jameson added, "that fairy tales aren't real. Beauty and the Beast doesn't work when beauty becomes the beast." More laughter, louder now. At the head table, Richard Lane heard every word. His jaw clenched so tightly that a small muscle jumped in his cheek. His hands, which had negotiated billion-dollar mergers without trembling, shook slightly as he set down his champagne glass. But he didn't move. Didn't stand. Didn't cross the ballroom floor to tell those entitled children exactly what he thought of them, because he knew that would only make things worse for Clara. And Clara, because she had been living with this for 3 years now, had developed the kind of hearing that trauma victims develop, selective, hypersensitive to threats. She heard the words monster and gargoyle as clearly as if they'd been shouted. Her shoulders tensed. Her breathing became shallow. Her hands, folded so carefully in her lap, began to tremble. She had promised her father she would come tonight, had promised she would try, had promised she would be brave, but brave was so much harder than people who'd never needed it understood. Across the ballroom, on the opposite end of the social spectrum, Ben Harper moved through the crowd with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to be invisible. At 36, he had the kind of face that blended into backgrounds, not unattractive, but not memorable either. His features were ordinary: brown eyes, straight nose, square jaw covered in perpetual 5 o'clock shadow no matter how recently he'd shaved. His dark hair was cut short and starting to show gray at the temples. His hands were calloused, scarred, the hands of someone who'd worked for everything he had. The waiter's uniform he wore, black pants, white shirt, black vest, black tie, had been provided by the catering company that staffed the Lane Industries gala every year. It wasn't quite the right size. The vest pulled slightly across his shoulders, which were broader than average, built by years of military service and physical labor. The pants were a fraction too short, showing slightly more ankle than was fashionable. But he wore it with dignity, moving through the glittering crowd with his head up, his posture straight, serving champagne and collecting empty glasses with the kind of quiet competence that the best service workers possess. He had been working the gala circuit for 6 months now, picking up shifts through the catering company whenever they called, adding to the patchwork income he cobbled together from 3 part-time jobs. During the day, he worked construction. 3 evenings a week, he washed dishes at a diner near the elementary school where his daughter went. And whenever the catering company needed extra hands for high-end events, he showed up, put on the uniform, and moved through ballrooms full of people who would never see him as anything but help. He didn't mind being invisible. Invisibility meant safety. It meant no one asked questions about his past, about the scars that ran across his back and chest, about the nightmares that still woke him up 3 or 4 times a week, sweating and reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. Invisibility meant he could provide for Emma. That was all that mattered. He was carrying a tray of empty champagne glasses toward the service entrance when he heard the laughter from the bar. Something about the quality of it, the edge of cruelty, the performative meanness, made him pause. He'd heard that kind of laughter before, in different contexts. In high school, directed at the kid who wore the same pants 3 days in a row because his family couldn't afford more. In boot camp, directed at the recruit who couldn't keep up on the obstacle course. In combat, directed at nothing and everything, the kind of laughter that happened when fear had nowhere else to go. He didn't mean to eavesdrop, but Marcus Drummond's voice carried, especially when he wanted it to. Seriously, though, who would dance with that? You'd have to be desperate or blind. Ben's hands tightened on the tray. Tyler Preston's response was equally audible. Maybe they should hire someone. You know, like those rent-a-date services. Except this would be rent-a-pity dance. Lane could afford it. The laughter that followed made something cold and sharp settle in Ben's chest. He turned, slowly, and followed the direction of their gazes across the ballroom to the head table, to the young woman sitting alone in the midnight blue gown, her face turned away from the crowd, her shoulders drawn up as if she were trying to physically shrink into herself. Even from across the room, he could see the scar, could see the careful way her hair had been arranged to minimize it, could see the slight pull at the corner of her eye, the discoloration of the skin. And he could see something else that the young men at the bar had either missed or didn't care about, the way her hands trembled in her lap, the shallow rise and fall of her breathing, the particular stillness of someone who is holding themselves together by force of will alone. He knew that stillness, had worn it himself years ago when he'd come back from Kandahar with burns covering 30% of his body, when he'd stood at his wife's funeral and felt every eye in the church on his bandaged face and hands, when he'd heard the whispers about whether he'd be able to care for baby Emma, whether it would be better if social services stepped in. He knew what it felt like to be looked at and found wanting, to be reduced to your wounds, to become invisible in the worst way, not because people didn't see you, but because they saw only the parts of you that were broken and decided that was all there was. The tray in his hand suddenly felt unbearably heavy. He looked at Clara Lane, really looked at her, and something in his chest cracked open, some wall he'd built to protect himself from caring too much about other people's pain. Because he recognized her. Not her face, not her name, not her wealth or privilege, or any of the external markers that made her Clara Lane, daughter of billionaire CEO Richard Lane. He recognized her loneliness. And loneliness, he had learned, was the great equalizer. It didn't care about your bank account or your zip code, or whether you wore designer gowns or secondhand uniforms. It just sat in your chest like a stone and waited for you to either make peace with it or drown under its weight. "Harper, you daydreaming?" The sharp voice belonged to Gerald, the head of the catering staff, a perpetually stressed man in his 50s who ran the events with military precision and had no patience for wool gathering. "Those glasses don't walk themselves to the kitchen," Ben jerked back to awareness. "Sorry, on it." He carried the tray toward the service entrance, deposited the glasses in the industrial dishwasher, and returned to the ballroom. The orchestra had shifted to a new song, something slow and romantic, and several couples had moved to the dance floor, older couples mostly, married for decades, moving through the steps with the kind of practiced ease that came from years of similar events. Near the bar, Marcus and his friends were still watching Clara, still making comments that Ben couldn't quite hear, but could easily imagine. And at the head table, Richard Lane sat with his hands clenched around his champagne glass, looking like a man being slowly torn apart. Ben picked up a fresh tray of champagne and began moving through the crowd again. His route took him past the head table, close enough to see Clara's face and profile, close enough to see the glisten of moisture at the corner of her eye that she was desperately trying to blink away. Something in his chest tightened painfully. He had served at dozens of these galas over the past 6 months, had seen the same patterns play out over and over, the wealthy talking to the wealthy, the powerful consolidating their power, the young heirs and heiresses performing their carefully choreographed social dances while their parents watched and judged and calculated the value of every interaction. He had learned to move through these events without really seeing them, to do his job efficiently and professionally while keeping his thoughts and feelings carefully locked away. But tonight, something was different. Maybe it was the particular cruelty of the young men at the bar. Maybe it was the look on Richard Lane's face, the obvious helplessness of a man who could buy almost anything except his daughter's happiness. Maybe it was just that Ben had reached his limit of watching people suffer when something could be done about it. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe he was just tired of being invisible. He set the tray down on a nearby side table, carefully positioning it so it wouldn't be knocked over. His hands were steady, which surprised him because his heart was pounding hard enough that he could feel his pulse in his throat. He wiped his palms on the sides of his vest, straightened his tie, and took a deep breath. What he was about to do violated every unspoken rule of events like this. Waiters were supposed to be invisible, interchangeable, part of the background. They were supposed to serve and clear and maintain the machinery of the event without ever stepping into the foreground, without ever presuming to be participants rather than facilitators. But Ben Harper had spent 12 years in the military, had survived an explosion that should have killed him, had buried his wife and raised his daughter alone through circumstances that would have broken weaker men. He had learned, through fire and loss, and the kind of suffering that either destroys you or makes you dangerous, that there were moments when the rules mattered less than the right thing. This was one of those moments. He began walking across the ballroom floor, his steps steady despite the fact that his heart was hammering. The crowd parted around him automatically, people stepping aside for the waiter without really seeing him, without registering that he was moving with purpose rather than just circulating with drinks. The distance from where he'd been standing to the head table was perhaps 50 feet. It felt like 50 miles. As he got closer, conversations began to falter. People noticed the waiter walking toward the CEO's daughter, noticed the determined set of his shoulders, noticed that something unusual was happening. The crowd didn't fall silent all at once. It was more gradual than that, a ripple of awareness spreading outward as more people registered the scene unfolding before them. At the bar, Marcus Drummond saw Ben first. He nudged Tyler and pointed, his expression shifting from amusement to curiosity. What the hell is the help doing? By the time Ben reached the head table, at least 100 people were watching. The orchestra, sensing something happening, let the current song trail off into silence, which only made the moment more dramatic, more exposed. Clara didn't see him approaching. She was staring down at her hands, fighting to keep her composure, probably counting seconds until she could reasonably excuse herself and disappear to the bathroom or the garden or anywhere that wasn't here. Richard Lane saw him, though. His eyes tracked Ben's approach with the wariness of a man who'd spent his life watching for threats and opportunities, trying to calculate which category this waiter fell into. Ben stopped in front of Clara, close enough that he could see the delicate embroidery on her gown, close enough to see the careful layers of makeup on the left side of her face, close enough to see that she was maybe 3 seconds away from crying. He cleared his throat softly. Clara's head jerked up, startled. Her eyes, one slightly pulled by the scar tissue but both the same striking blue, met his with an expression of confusion and something else, something that looked like fear. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Ben saw a young woman who'd been hurt and was still hurting, who was trying so hard to be brave in a room full of people who'd decided she wasn't worth their kindness. Clara saw a waiter, older than her, ordinary-looking, with kind eyes and work-roughened hands, who was standing in front of her when he had absolutely no reason to be there. The ballroom was silent now. Hundreds of people watching, waiting. Ben took a breath, and then he did something that probably violated a dozen protocols and would almost certainly get him fired. He bowed. Not a casual nod, but a real bow, formal and respectful, the kind you'd give to someone who mattered. When he straightened, he looked directly into Clara's eyes and spoke in a voice that was quiet but steady, meant for her, but audible to the silent crowd. "Excuse me, miss," he said. "May I have this dance?" The silence that followed was so complete that Ben could hear his own heartbeat, could hear the distant sound of traffic from the street outside, could hear Clara's sharp intake of breath. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She looked at him like he'd just spoken in a foreign language she didn't understand, like he'd just asked her to fly, like the world had suddenly inverted and she was trying to figure out which way was up. "You're..." She stopped, swallowed, tried again. Her voice was barely a whisper, rough with emotion. "You're a waiter." It wasn't meant as an insult. It was simple confusion, an attempt to make sense of something that didn't fit into any of the social rules she'd been raised with, any of the patterns that governed events like this. Ben smiled, and there was nothing performative about it, nothing calculated. Just genuine warmth, the kind of smile that reached his eyes and made the corners crinkle. "Yes," he said simply. "And you're the bravest woman in this room." Clara's eyes widened. A single tear spilled over and traced down her right cheek, following the curve where the scar did not run. "I'm not," she started, but her voice broke. "You are," Ben said, and his voice carried absolute certainty, the kind of conviction that couldn't be argued with because it came from somewhere deeper than opinion. "You walked in here tonight knowing exactly what people would say, what they would think, how they would look at you. And you came anyway. You sat at this table with your head up and your shoulders back. That's the definition of brave." At the bar, Marcus Drummond made a disgusted sound. "Oh, this is pathetic. Someone stop this. Shut up!" Richard Lane's voice cut across the ballroom like a knife, sharp and absolute. He hadn't stood, hadn't raised his voice above a normal speaking volume, but the command in it was unmistakable. Every person in the room turned to look at him, and what they saw made them take an involuntary step back. Richard Lane had built an empire on the ability to project power, to make men twice his size feel small with nothing but a look and a tone. He used that power now, directing the full force of his presence at the young men at the bar. "Say another word," Richard said quietly, "and your families will be explaining to their shareholders why their heirs are no longer welcome in polite society. Test me on this." Marcus paled. Tyler actually took a step backward. Jameson looked down at his shoes. The crowd seemed to exhale collectively. Richard's gaze moved from the chastened young men to Ben, who was still standing in front of Clara, his hand now extended palm up in the universal gesture of invitation. The CEO's eyes were wet, his jaw working as he fought for control. He nodded once, sharply. Permission granted. Ben kept his focus on Clara. She was staring at his extended hand like it was a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. Something desperately needed but terrifying to reach for, because reaching meant admitting you needed saving, and admitting that meant acknowledging how close to drowning you actually were. "You don't have to," Ben said gently. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable. I just thought everyone should get to dance at a party, especially the guest of honor." "I'm not the guest of honor," Clara whispered. "It's my father's gala. I'm just here." "Then be here with me," Ben said. "Just for one song. Let them see you the way I see you, not as someone broken, but as someone whole." Something in Clara's chest cracked open. Or maybe it was something that had been cracked for years finally starting to heal. She couldn't tell the difference. Her hand trembled as she lifted it from her lap. The movement felt enormous, momentous, like picking up something impossibly heavy. Her fingers hovered over his palm for a heartbeat, 2, 3. And then she placed her hand in his. His hand closed around hers, warm and calloused and solid, and Clara felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Safe. Ben helped her to her feet with the careful courtesy of someone who understood that sometimes the simple act of standing required courage. He didn't pull, didn't rush, just offered support and let her move at her own pace. The crowd parted as Ben led Clara toward the dance floor. The sea of elegant people in their designer clothes and expensive jewelry stepped aside for the waiter in the ill-fitting uniform and the scarred girl in the midnight blue gown. And the silence that had fallen when Ben first approached the table deepened into something almost sacred. Clara's legs felt unsteady, and she was grateful for Ben's hand supporting her. She was hyper-aware of every eye in the room, every whisper that wasn't quite whispered, every judgment being rendered. The left side of her face felt like it was burning, like the scar had suddenly become illuminated, a neon sign announcing her damage to everyone present. "Look at me," Ben said softly as they reached the center of the dance floor. "Not them. Just me." Clara lifted her gaze from the floor and found his eyes, brown and steady and kind in a way that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with recognition. He placed his right hand on her waist, properly formal, maintaining respectful distance. She put her left hand on his shoulder, and he could feel it trembling. His left hand held her right hand at exactly the right height, and somewhere in the back of his mind, Ben thanked his mother for insisting he learn to dance properly before his senior prom 20 years ago. For a long moment, they just stood there, posed but motionless. Two people at the center of a spotlight neither of them had asked for. Then the orchestra began to play. It was a slow waltz, something classical that Ben didn't recognize but that his feet seemed to know anyway. He led, gently, moving Clara through the basic steps with the kind of patience that came from teaching Emma how to ride a bike, how to tie her shoes, how to do long division. Small movements at first, just enough to establish rhythm, to let Clara's body remember what her mind might have forgotten. She was stiff at first, her shoulders tense, her movements mechanical. But Ben didn't rush her, didn't try to force anything flashy or dramatic. He just moved with steady confidence, his hand on her waist providing gentle pressure to guide direction changes, his eyes staying locked on hers. "When was the last time you danced?" he asked quietly, his voice just for her. Clara's throat tightened. "Before," she said. Everything good was before. "Then we'll make a new before," Ben said. "This moment, right now. Before becomes now, and now becomes the memory you'll look back on." They moved across the polished floor, slow circles, careful steps. The gown swirled around Clara's legs like dark water, and gradually, so gradually she almost didn't notice, her shoulders began to lower, her movements began to soften, her breathing began to even out. "Why are you doing this?" she asked suddenly, and there was something raw in her voice, something desperate. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Ben was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. 6 years ago, he said finally, I came back from overseas with burns covering half my body. My wife had died while I was deployed, cancer, sudden and vicious. I had a 3-year-old daughter who didn't remember me and a face that made people look away. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror for hours, trying to recognize myself, trying to figure out if I was still the same person or if the fire had burned away everything I'd been. Clara's eyes widened. "I didn't know." "There's a moment," Ben continued, still moving them through the steps, still holding her gaze, "when you have to decide. You can let the scars define you, can let them become the story everyone tells about you, the first thing anyone sees, or you can define them. Decide that they're just part of your story, not the whole thing, not even the most important thing." His hand tightened slightly on her waist. "I see you, Clara, not the scar, you. And what I see is someone brave enough to show up, strong enough to survive, beautiful enough that every person in this room can't look away." The tears came then, silent and unstoppable, streaming down both sides of Clara's face, and she didn't care, didn't try to hide, didn't turn away. Because for the first time in 3 years, someone had seen her, really seen her, and hadn't flinched. Around them, the crowd watched in silence. No one laughed now. No one whispered cruel jokes or made cutting comments. Because sometimes, rarely, human beings remember what humanity looks like. It looks like a waiter in an ill-fitting uniform dancing with a scarred girl at a charity gala. It looks like someone saying, "You're brave," and meaning it. It looks like grace. And then, from somewhere in the silent crowd, someone began to clap. Just one person at first, slow, deliberate applause that sounded almost too loud in the quiet ballroom. Then another joined in. And another. The applause built like a wave, spreading from the front of the room to the back, from the oldest guest to the youngest, from the most powerful to the least. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was clapping. Not the polite, scattered applause that had punctuated the evening's speeches and presentations, but real applause, sustained and heartfelt. Clara heard it and couldn't quite believe it. She looked around the ballroom, her eyes wide, taking in the sea of faces that were smiling, genuinely smiling at her, not with pity, not with mockery, with something that looked suspiciously like admiration. "See," Ben said softly. "They see you now, really see you." At the head table, Richard Lane had his hand over his mouth, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. For 3 years, he had watched his daughter retreat from the world, had seen her light dim, had felt helpless in the face of her pain despite all his wealth and power and influence. And now, because of a waiter he didn't know, whose name he hadn't even asked, she was dancing. His little girl was dancing. The song continued, and Ben and Clara moved through the steps with increasing confidence, her body relaxing into his lead, his hand steady on her waist. Other couples began to join them on the dance floor, older couples who'd been married for decades, younger couples who'd known each other for weeks, people who'd been sitting alone and suddenly felt brave enough to reach out and ask someone else to dance. The ballroom came alive with movement and music, and at the center of it all, a waiter and a scarred girl danced like they were the only two people in the world. "Thank you," Clara whispered, so quietly that Ben almost didn't hear it over the music. "I don't even know your name, but thank you." "Ben," he said. "Ben Harper." "And you're welcome, Miss Lane." "Clara," she corrected. "Just Clara." He smiled. "Just Clara, then." They were still dancing, still moving through the crowd of couples, when a small voice cut through the music like a bell. "Daddy?" Ben's head whipped around so fast he nearly lost his balance. His heart, which had been beating fast from nerves and adrenaline, suddenly kicked into overdrive for an entirely different reason. Because there, standing in the doorway of the ballroom in her pink dress and light-up sneakers, clutching a piece of paper in one hand and looking around the glittering crowd with wide eyes, was Emma, his 9-year-old daughter who was supposed to be at home with the babysitter. "Emma?" Ben's voice came out strangled. "What are you? How did you?" But Emma had already spotted him. Her face lit up with pure joy, and she took off running across the ballroom floor, her sneakers lighting up with every step, completely oblivious to the fact that she was disrupting a formal gala attended by 500 of the country's wealthiest people. Ben released Clara's waist, but kept hold of her hand as he dropped to one knee to catch Emma as she crashed into him with the full-body enthusiasm that 9-year-olds brought to everything they did. "Daddy, I saw you dancing!" Emma's voice carried across the ballroom, high and excited and utterly unconcerned with social propriety. "Mrs. Rodriguez was watching the live stream on her phone, and I saw you dancing with the pretty lady." "The live stream," Ben repeated weakly, his brain struggling to process. "Of course." Lane Industries always live-streamed their charity galas, broadcasting to remote donors and stakeholders, which meant Emma and thousands of other people had watched him cross the ballroom and ask Clara to dance, which meant he was definitely getting fired. But Emma wasn't done. She pulled back from the hug and held up the piece of paper she'd been clutching, waving it proudly. "Look, I drew you a picture." The crowd pressed closer, trying to see. Clara bent down slightly, her curiosity overcoming her self-consciousness. The drawing was exactly what you'd expect from a 9-year-old. Stick figures in bright crayon, enthusiastic and slightly chaotic. But there was something undeniably sweet about it. A tall stick figure in black, labeled Daddy in Emma's uneven handwriting, held hands with a shorter stick figure in blue labeled Princess. They stood on a dance floor drawn in purple crayon, surrounded by yellow stars. And across the top, in crayon letters that filled the entire width of the paper, Emma had written, "Daddy dancing with a princess." Clara's hand flew to her mouth. A sound escaped her, half laugh, half sob. "That's..." She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't find words for what she was feeling, looking at this child's simple, generous interpretation of what had just happened. Not Daddy dancing with the scarred girl, or Daddy dancing with the damaged one, just Daddy dancing with a princess. Emma, oblivious to the emotion she'd provoked, held the drawing out to Clara. "It's for you, because you're pretty, and you made my daddy smile, and he doesn't smile very much usually." The crowd around them made a collective sound, somewhere between awe and a sob. That probably would have been embarrassing if anyone had been thinking clearly enough to be embarrassed. Clara took the drawing with trembling hands. She stared at it for a long moment, at the simple crayon lines and misspelled words and enthusiastic stars. Then she sank down, thousands of dollars worth of designer gown pooling on the floor around her, so she was at Emma's eye level. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "This is the most beautiful thing anyone's ever given me." Emma beamed. Then, with the casual directness of children who haven't yet learned to filter their observations, she reached out and touched the left side of Clara's face, her small fingers gentle on the scar. The crowd gasped. Ben started to intervene. "Emma, no, you can't." But Clara caught his hand, stopping him. She stayed perfectly still as Emma traced the line of the scar with one finger, her expression curious but not cruel, scientific rather than judgmental. "Does it hurt?" Emma asked. Clara shook her head. Not anymore. It did for a long time. But now it just is. Good, Emma said firmly. Then, with the certainty that only children possess, "You're pretty. Don't let anyone tell you different." And then she hugged Clara, wrapping her small arms around the woman's shoulders and squeezing tight. Clara's composure, which had been holding by a thread, shattered completely. She wrapped her arms around Emma and held on like she was drowning, and this 9-year-old child was the only solid thing in the world. Her shoulders shook with sobs, 3 years' worth of pain and loneliness and fear pouring out in one overwhelming wave. Emma just patted her back, the way kids do when they're trying to comfort adults but aren't quite sure how. "It's okay," she said. "Daddy cries sometimes too. He says sometimes crying is how you get the sad out, so there's room for happy again." The crowd, which had been silent with shock, erupted. Applause thundered through the ballroom, so loud it was almost physical, so sustained it seemed like it might never stop. People who'd been sitting stood. People who'd been standing moved closer, trying to see, trying to be part of this moment. Strangers wiped tears from their eyes. Grown men who ran corporations and commanded boardrooms found themselves unexpectedly emotional, their carefully maintained facades cracking in the face of such raw, honest humanity. At the bar, Marcus Drummond stared at his bourbon glass, his face pale. Tyler Preston looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. Jameson Blackwell had already disappeared, probably to call his publicist and start damage control. And at the head table, Richard Lane rose to his feet. He moved through the crowd with the kind of authority that made people automatically step aside, his eyes fixed on his daughter, on the waiter, on the small girl who had somehow said exactly what the entire ballroom needed to hear. His face was wet with tears he'd stopped trying to hide, and his hands were shaking, and he didn't care who saw. When he reached them, Ben was helping Clara to her feet while Emma held her hand, chattering happily about how she'd convinced Mrs. Rodriguez to call an Uber because, "This was important, Daddy. I had to give the princess her picture." Richard looked at Ben for a long moment. Really looked at him. Not as a waiter, not as part of the staff, but as a man, as a father, as someone who had just done what Richard himself had been unable to do for 3 years. "You—" Richard's voice cracked. He cleared his throat, tried again. "You gave her back her smile." Ben shook his head, suddenly uncomfortable with the attention, with the weight of Richard Lane's gratitude. "No, sir. I didn't give her anything. She never lost it. She just needed a reason to show it again." Richard made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "What's your name?" "Ben Harper." "Well, Ben Harper." Richard extended his hand, and when Ben took it, the CEO pulled him into a hug that probably violated every social protocol Richard had ever learned. "Thank you. Thank you for seeing what I'd been too blind to see." When Richard released him, he turned to Clara, who was still holding Emma's hand, the crayon drawing clutched to her chest like treasure. Father and daughter looked at each other for a moment, and something passed between them, an understanding, a recognition, a healing. Richard pulled her into his arms and held her the way he hadn't since before the accident, when she'd still felt like his little girl instead of something precious and fragile that might shatter if he held too tight. "I'm so sorry," he whispered into her hair. "So sorry I didn't protect you from them. From all of this. Dad?" Clara's voice was muffled against his shoulder. "You can't protect me from the world, but you can stand with me in it." "Then that's what I'll do," Richard said fiercely. "Every day. I promise." The orchestra, sensing that the moment needed something, began to play again, a gentle melody that filled the ballroom without overwhelming it. Around them, the crowd was still applauding, still smiling, still wiping tears from their eyes. Gerald, the head of catering, appeared at Ben's elbow. His face was flushed, his eyes wide. "Harper, what the hell were you thinking? You can't just— You violated about 15 different protocols." Ben braced himself for the firing he knew was coming, but Richard Lane turned to Gerald with an expression that could have frozen fire. "This man," he said quietly, "just taught every person in this room a lesson worth more than all their wealth combined. If you have a problem with that, take it up with me." Gerald swallowed hard. "No, sir. No problem at all, sir." "Good." Richard looked back at Ben. "Are you working tomorrow?" Yes. Construction site in the morning, then the diner. Cancel them. Ben blinked. Ben, sir? I'd like to offer you a position with Lane Industries, Richard said. I need someone in my security department who understands what real courage looks like. Someone who knows that protecting people sometimes means standing with them, not just standing in front of them. Ben opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Mr. Lane, I appreciate the offer, but I don't have any experience in corporate security. I'm just a decorated veteran with 12 years of military service, if I'm reading you correctly. Richard interrupted. The way you carry yourself, the scars on your hands, the fact that you didn't hesitate to do the right thing, even when it violated every social rule in the room. You've got leadership written all over you, son. You just need someone to give you a chance. Emma tugged on Ben's hand. Daddy, say yes. Then you wouldn't have to work 3 jobs and you could come to my soccer games. Ben looked down at his daughter, at her hopeful face and light-up sneakers, at the crayon dust still on her fingers from drawing the picture that had somehow changed everything. Then he looked at Clara, who was smiling, really smiling, the first genuine smile he'd seen on her face all night, bright enough to light the entire ballroom. On one condition, Ben said slowly. Richard raised an eyebrow. Name it. I still need to be home by 3:30 to pick Emma up from school, and I need all her soccer game days off. She's 9. She needs her father. Richard's expression softened. Done. Anything else? Ben hesitated, then gestured to Clara. She needs security too. Not just physical security. She needs someone who understands that the real threat isn't outside trying to get in. It's inside these rooms, hiding behind expensive suits and trust funds. She needs someone who'll stand with her, not just guard her. Clara's eyes widened. You do that? You deserve to feel safe, Ben said simply. Everyone does. Richard looked between his daughter and the waiter who'd somehow become the most important person in the room in the space of one dance. He nodded slowly. Then that's the job. You'll work primarily with Clara, help her navigate events like this. He paused, searching for the right words. Be the person who makes sure she never has to sit alone again. Emma made a happy sound and hugged Ben's leg. Does that mean we get to come to more fancy parties? Emma, Ben said in his I'm trying to be serious voice. Because I like fancy parties, Emma continued, undeterred. And Clara needs friends. I could be her friend. I'm very good at being friends. Clara laughed. Actually laughed, the sound surprising even her. I would love that, she said, and meant it. She looked at Ben, at this man who'd crossed a ballroom full of people who should have mattered but didn't, who'd seen her pain and decided to do something about it. Thank you for everything. Thank me by showing up at the next one of these events, Ben said, with your head up and your shoulders back. Let them see what brave looks like. The evening continued, but something had fundamentally shifted. The young men who'd made cruel comments found themselves surrounded by uncomfortable silence whenever they tried to speak, their social currency suddenly devalued. Older couples sought out Clara to apologize for their silence, for their complicity, for not speaking up sooner. Business leaders approached Richard to praise his daughter's courage and to subtly distance themselves from the behavior of their heirs. And in the middle of it all, Ben Harper stood with his daughter, watching Clara talk and laugh with people who were actually seeing her for the first time. And he thought about how sometimes the smallest acts, offering a hand, asking for a dance, drawing a picture, could change everything. Gerald approached him again, this time with something that might have been respect in his eyes. Harper, you're done for the night. Go enjoy the party. I'm still in uniform, Ben protested. Then consider yourself promoted. Gerald almost smiled. Besides, I think your daughter wants dessert. Emma, who had indeed been eyeing the dessert table with intense focus, lit up. Daddy, can I have one of those tiny cakes? The petits fours? The tiny cakes, Emma insisted. Ben laughed, and the sound was lighter than it had been in months. Okay, let's get you some tiny cakes. As they walked toward the dessert table, Emma holding tight to his hand, Ben passed a mirror that lined one wall of the ballroom. He caught sight of himself, uniform rumpled, tie slightly askew, Emma's crayon dust on his vest from where she'd hugged him. And for the first time in years, he recognized the person looking back at him. Not the scars, not the loss, not the struggle, just himself. Whole. Behind him in the reflection, he could see Clara in her midnight blue gown, surrounded by people but no longer drowning in them, her smile genuine, her posture relaxed. And he thought about what he'd told her on the dance floor, about how scars didn't have to define you, about how you could choose to write your own story. Maybe he'd been talking to himself as much as to her. The ballroom continued its glittering performance, but now there was something different in the air, something warmer, more human, more real. The kind of magic that doesn't come from chandeliers and champagne, but from people choosing to be kind when kindness costs them something, from courage being recognized and celebrated, from grace being offered without conditions. Emma got her tiny cake, 3 of them, actually, and promptly got frosting on her face. Ben wiped it off with a napkin while she giggled, and somewhere nearby, he heard Clara laugh at something someone said, and Richard's voice joining in, and he thought, This is what winning looks like. Not the medals, not the money, not the status or the security or the success, just this, his daughter safe and happy, tiny cake frosting on her face, and a girl who'd been drowning finally learning to breathe again. The night was far from over. There would be more conversations, more revelations, more moments of connection and healing. But in that moment, surrounded by chandeliers and champagne and 500 people who'd just been reminded what humanity looked like, Ben Harper, single father, veteran, waiter, and now protector of scarred princesses, felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. And sometimes, hope is enough to change everything. The reception line that formed around Clara was something Richard Lane had never imagined he'd see. For 3 years, people had either avoided his daughter entirely or approached her with the kind of careful, pitying tone reserved for the terminally ill. But now, in the aftermath of Ben Harper's simple act of courage, something had shifted in the collective consciousness of the ballroom. People wanted to talk to her, really talk to her, not just fulfill some social obligation. Mrs. Patricia Whitmore, a 72-year-old philanthropist whose family had built their fortune in railroads during the previous century, was the first to approach. She moved with the careful dignity of age, her silver gown rustling as she walked, her eyes sharp behind designer glasses that probably cost more than Ben's monthly rent. "Clara, dear," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from decades of commanding ballrooms and boardrooms alike. "I owe you an apology." Clara blinked, surprised. "Mrs. Whitmore, you don't—" "I do." The older woman's voice was firm. "I've attended these galas for 23 years. I've watched you grow up, watched you become a beautiful young woman, and then watched you retreat after the accident, and I said nothing, did nothing. I let those boys at the bar make their cruel comments, let the whispers continue, because it was easier to look away than to stand up." She reached out and took Clara's hand. "That waiter showed more courage in 5 minutes than I've shown in 3 years, and for that, I am deeply ashamed." Clara's throat tightened. "You're not responsible for other people's cruelty." "No," Mrs. Whitmore agreed. "But I'm responsible for my own silence. And silence, my dear, is its own form of cruelty." She squeezed Clara's hand gently. "You are a remarkable young woman. Your scar doesn't diminish that. If anything, it proves it. Survival takes strength that most of us will never need to find." Before Clara could respond, Mrs. Whitmore turned to the crowd that had gathered nearby, watching the exchange with varying degrees of discomfort. Her voice rang out clearly, designed to carry. "I think we all learned something important tonight. Grace isn't about the size of your bank account or the designer of your gown. It's about seeing someone in pain and choosing to do something about it." Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. A few had the decency to look ashamed. As Mrs. Whitmore moved away, others stepped forward. Some offered genuine apologies. Others simply wanted to tell Clara how beautiful she looked, how brave she was, how inspiring the dance had been. A few were clearly there because it was now the socially advantageous thing to do, but Clara found she didn't mind. Even performative kindness was better than authentic cruelty. Across the ballroom, Ben had successfully secured 3 Petit Fours for Emma and was attempting to keep her from eating all of them in under 30 seconds when he felt a presence at his elbow. He turned to find a man in his late 50s standing there, regarding him with an expression that was difficult to read. "Thomas Chen," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm the CFO of Lane Industries." Ben wiped frosting off his palm before shaking. "Ben Harper. Though I guess you probably know that by now." "The whole ballroom knows that by now," Thomas said with a slight smile. That was quite the performance. Something in his tone made Ben stiffen. "It wasn't a performance." "No," Thomas agreed, his expression softening. "I can see that, which makes it even more remarkable." He glanced at Emma, who was attempting to eat her second petit four in the most inefficient way possible, getting frosting on her nose, cheeks, and somehow her forehead. "Your daughter?" "Emma. She's 9, and she's supposed to be at home with a babysitter, but apparently she has her own ideas about where she should be." Emma looked up at the mention of her name, smiled at Thomas with frosting-covered teeth, and went back to her cake. Thomas laughed, a genuine sound that made the corners of his eyes crinkle. "My daughter was the same way at that age, convinced she knew better than everyone else. She's a lawyer now, so I guess she was right." He paused, then continued in a lower voice. "Richard Lane is a good man, but he's been broken for 3 years watching his daughter suffer. What you did tonight, asking her to dance, treating her like a person instead of a tragedy, that's going to matter more than you realize." "I just did what anyone should have done," Ben said uncomfortably. "But no one else did," Thomas pointed out. "That's the difference between should and is. You saw a problem and fixed it. In my experience, people who do that are rare and valuable." Before Ben could respond, Emma tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy, that lady is crying." Ben followed her gaze across the ballroom to where a woman in her 40s stood near one of the tall windows, wiping tears from her face while trying to maintain composure. She was well dressed, but not extravagantly so, and there was something about the way she stood, slightly apart from the crowd, watching Clara with an intensity that went beyond casual interest, that made Ben's trained instincts prickle. "Excuse me," he said to Thomas, then made his way toward the woman, Emma's hand in his. As he approached, the woman seemed to sense his presence. She turned, and Ben saw that her eyes were red from crying, her mascara slightly smudged despite her obvious attempts to repair it. "I'm sorry," she said immediately, her voice thick. "I'm making a scene. I should probably go." "You're not making a scene," Ben said gently. "Are you all right?" The woman laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's a complicated question." She looked past him to where Claire was still surrounded by well-wishers. "I had a daughter, Sarah. She was Clara's age, beautiful, smart, full of life." Her voice broke slightly. "She died in a car accident 5 years ago. Single vehicle collision on the highway. The investigator said she fell asleep at the wheel." Ben's chest tightened. "I'm so sorry." "She had a scar," the woman continued, seeming to need to tell the story now that she'd started. "Not as visible as Clara's, but it was there. A long line down her arm from when she fell out of a tree as a child. She used to hate it, would wear long sleeves even in summer to hide it." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "After she died, I'd give anything to see that scar again, to see any part of her again." Emma, with the directness of children, asked, "What was your daughter's name?" "Sarah Michelle Porter," the woman said, and there was such love in the way she said it that Ben felt his own eyes sting. "That's a pretty name," Emma said seriously. "I bet she was nice." "She was," Sarah's mother said, smiling through tears. "She was extraordinary." She looked back at Clara. "When that young man asked her to dance, when she stood up and let everyone see her, scar and all, I realized something. My daughter never got that chance. Never got to reclaim her body, her scars, her story. But Clara did. And watching it happen felt like," she struggled for words, "like maybe all the beautiful, scarred, surviving daughters in the world got a little bit braver tonight." Ben didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know how to respond to grief that deep and enduring. So he did what Emma had taught him was sometimes the right thing. He just stood there and bore witness to it. Let this grieving mother tell her story without trying to fix it or minimize it or make it easier to hear. "Thank you," Sarah's mother said after a moment, "for what you did tonight, for seeing her, for all of them." As she walked away, Emma squeezed Ben's hand. "Daddy, is she going to be okay?" "Eventually," Ben said, hoping it was true. Sometimes people just need time. The evening progressed, and the energy in the ballroom continued to shift and evolve. The orchestra played, couples danced, conversations flowed from table to table like water finding its level. But underneath the surface normalcy, something fundamental had changed. People looked at each other differently now, spoke to each other with less performance and more authenticity. The cruel edge that had characterized the early part of the evening had been blunted, replaced by something that felt almost like community. Near the bar, now significantly less crowded than before, Marcus Drummond sat alone, nursing his third bourbon and feeling the weight of every eye that refused to meet his. His phone had already started buzzing with text messages from his father, who had apparently been watching the live stream from his hotel in Dubai and was extremely interested in discussing his son's behavior at the earliest possible opportunity. Tyler and Jameson had both disappeared, probably to begin their own damage control efforts, leaving Marcus alone with his rapidly deteriorating social standing. He watched Clara laugh at something someone said, watched her father stand beside her with obvious pride, watched the waiter, Ben Harper apparently, being treated like an honored guest instead of staff. And Marcus felt something he wasn't accustomed to feeling, shame. He'd spent his entire life operating under the assumption that wealth and status gave him certain privileges, certain rights, the right to say what he wanted without consequences, the right to judge others without being judged himself, the right to be cruel if it was entertaining, to mock if it was funny, to diminish others if it made him feel larger. But watching Clara dance had stripped away that assumption like cheap paint, because in that moment, she had been more dignified, more graceful, more worthy of respect than he had ever been in his entire privileged life. And everyone in the ballroom had seen it. He set down his bourbon glass with a hand that wasn't quite steady and made a decision that surprised even himself. He stood, straightened his tuxedo, and began walking toward the cluster of people surrounding Clara. The crowd parted reluctantly as he approached, conversations dying as people registered who was coming. Richard Lane's expression went cold and dangerous. Ben Harper, who had just returned with Emma from their encounter with Sarah's mother, stepped slightly forward, positioning himself between Marcus and Clara without even seeming to think about it. Marcus stopped a respectful distance away, suddenly feeling like he was facing a firing squad. "Miss Lane," he said, and his voice came out rougher than intended. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Clara's smile faded, her shoulders tensed. "I don't think we have anything to discuss." "We don't," Marcus agreed, "but I have something to say anyway, and I'd appreciate it if you'd let me say it." Richard moved to intervene, but Clara put a hand on her father's arm, stopping him. "It's okay, Dad." She looked at Marcus with an expression that held no warmth but also no fear. "Go ahead." Marcus swallowed hard. This would have been easier with a prepared speech, with time to craft the perfect words. But sometimes the right words were the honest ones, even when honesty was uncomfortable. "I said terrible things about you tonight," he began. "Cruel, inexcusable things. Not just tonight, actually. I've said them before, at other events, to other people. I treated you like you were less than human because of your scar, like that one thing erased everything else about you." He forced himself to maintain eye contact, forced himself not to look away. "There's no excuse for that, no justification. I was raised better, but I didn't act better, and that's on me." The ballroom had gone silent again, everyone straining to hear this unexpected confession. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Marcus continued. "I'm not asking you to. I just wanted you to know that I was wrong, completely, utterly wrong. And watching you dance tonight, watching you be brave when I've never had to be brave a day in my life, made me realize what a small, pathetic person I've been." His voice cracked slightly. "You deserve better. You've always deserved better." Clara studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. "Do you know what the worst part is? It's not the words. Words hurt, but I could handle words. The worst part is the silence. All the people who heard you say those things and said nothing, did nothing, just let it happen because it was easier than speaking up." Marcus flinched as if she'd slapped him. "I don't forgive you," Clara continued. "Maybe someday I will, but not tonight. Tonight I'm still too angry, and I have a right to be angry. What I will say is this. If you mean what you're saying, If this is real and not just damage control, then do better. Not just with me, but with everyone. Be the person you should have been instead of the person you chose to be. Marcus nodded, his throat too tight for words. He started to turn away, then paused. For what it's worth, that waiter is right. You are brave. Braver than any of us. As he walked away, Emma, who had been watching the entire exchange with the intense focus children bring to adult drama, tugged on Ben's hand. Daddy, what's damage control? It's what people do when they've made a mess and are trying to clean it up, Ben explained. Did he make a mess? A big one. Is he going to clean it up? Ben watched Marcus's retreating back, saw the slump in his shoulders, the defeat in his posture. I don't know, honey. I hope so. The incident had cast a slight pall over the gathering, but it lifted quickly as people returned to their conversations and the orchestra struck up a new song. Clara found herself surrounded again, this time by a group of young women near her age who wanted to talk about everything from fashion to career aspirations to the best way to handle public scrutiny. It was the kind of normal, casual conversation she hadn't had in years, and she soaked it in like someone dying of thirst. Richard took advantage of his daughter's distraction to pull Ben aside, gesturing toward a quieter corner of the ballroom near one of the tall windows that overlooked the hotel gardens. I meant what I said earlier, Richard began without preamble, about the job offer, but I want to make sure you understand what I'm actually offering. Ben nodded. Security position, working primarily with Clara. More than that, Richard said. I'm offering you a chance to be part of something important. Clara needs more than a bodyguard. She needs someone who understands that the real threats aren't always physical. Someone who can help her navigate social situations that might be hostile or uncomfortable. Someone who can spot the difference between genuine kindness and performative bullshit. He paused. Someone like you. Mr. Lane, I appreciate the offer. I really do. But I'm not sure I'm qualified for... You crossed a ballroom full of the country's wealthiest, most judgmental people to ask my daughter to dance, Richard interrupted. You did it, knowing you'd probably get fired, knowing people would mock you, knowing it would violate every social convention in the room. You did it anyway because it was the right thing to do. That tells me everything I need to know about your qualifications. Ben was quiet for a moment, considering. Can I ask you something? Anything. Why didn't you do it yourself? You're her father. You have all the power in this room. Why didn't you ask her to dance? The question hit Richard like a physical blow. His face went pale, then flushed. And for a moment Ben thought he'd overstepped, that he'd offended the man who'd just offered him a life-changing opportunity. But Richard didn't get angry. Instead, his shoulders sagged, and suddenly he looked every one of his 62 years. Because I was afraid, he said quietly. Afraid that if I drew attention to her, it would make things worse. Afraid that people would see my pity, my protectiveness, and it would confirm all their assumptions about her being damaged, broken, someone who needed to be taken care of rather than celebrated. He ran a hand through his silver hair. I told myself I was protecting her, but really, I was protecting myself from having to confront my own failure to make her feel safe in the first place. You didn't fail her, Ben said. Didn't I? Richard's voice was rough. For 3 years, I've watched her hide. Watched her cancel plans, avoid social situations, turn down opportunities because she was afraid of being seen. And I let her, because it hurt less than pushing her to engage with a world that had been so cruel to her. I enabled her retreat because confronting it would have meant confronting my own grief about what she'd lost. He looked back toward where Clara stood, laughing with the group of young women, her face animated and alive in a way he hadn't seen since before the accident. You gave her permission to be seen again, to be human again. That's not something a father should have to outsource to a stranger, but I'm grateful you were here to do what I couldn't. Ben didn't know what to say to that level of raw honesty from a man who probably hadn't admitted vulnerability to anyone in decades. So he said the only thing that felt true. She's remarkable. She always was. The scar doesn't change that. No, Richard agreed, but sometimes it takes an outside perspective to see what's been there all along. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the ballroom, watching Clara, watching Emma attempt to teach another little girl the proper way to eat petit four. The evening had taken on a dreamlike quality, as if they'd all stepped through a mirror into a slightly different version of the world, one where grace and courage mattered more than wealth and status. Thomas Chen approached, a serious expression on his face. Richard, we have a situation. Richard's businessman instincts kicked in immediately. What kind of situation? The good kind, actually. The live stream of the gala is blowing up on social media. The video of Ben asking Clara to dance has been shared over 1 million times in the last hour. People are calling it the most beautiful thing they've seen all year. There's a hashtag trending, #DanceWithCourage, and it's #1 in the country right now. Ben felt his stomach drop. 1 million times? More like 3 million now, Thomas corrected, checking his phone. And climbing. The comments are overwhelmingly positive. People talking about their own scars, their own struggles with visibility and acceptance, their own moments of choosing courage over comfort. This is resonating on a level I don't think any of us anticipated. Richard looked at Ben with an expression that was part concern, part excitement. How do you feel about being famous? Strongly against it, Ben said immediately. I have a daughter to protect. I don't want press following us around, people recognizing me on the street, any of that. Too late, Thomas said, not unkindly. You're already being identified. Someone found your military records. Looks like you're a decorated veteran. Purple Heart, Bronze Star, Combat Infantry Badge. The narrative is basically writing itself. Wounded warrior asks scarred heiress to dance, teaches billionaire ballroom about grace. Ben closed his eyes, feeling the weight of unwanted attention settling on his shoulders, like a heavy coat. This is going to complicate everything. Not necessarily, Richard said thoughtfully. We can control the narrative, limit your exposure, make sure your privacy and Emma's privacy are protected. But Thomas is right. This story is out there now, and trying to suppress it would only make it bigger. Better to shape it into something useful. Useful for what? For change, Richard said simply. Clara's been hiding for 3 years because the world made her feel like she had to. But tonight showed that when people see real courage, real grace, they respond to it. What if we could use this moment, this attention, to start a conversation about how we treat people with visible differences? About the cruelty of casual mockery, the importance of choosing kindness, the beauty of survival? Ben looked at Clara, who had just noticed the commotion and was making her way toward them with a questioning expression. That should be her choice, not mine. Agreed, Richard said. But I wanted you to know what we're dealing with before we talk to her about it. Clara arrived, Emma trailing behind her like a small pink shadow. What's going on? You all look way too serious for a party. Thomas explained about the live stream, the social media response, the hashtag. With each revelation, Claire's expression shifted from confusion to surprise to something that might have been cautious hope. 3 million people watched us dance, she said faintly. And counting, Thomas confirmed. The production company that handles our live stream says they've never seen engagement numbers like this. People are sharing their own stories, talking about their own scars, physical and emotional. It's become a movement almost overnight. Clara sank into a nearby chair, her midnight blue gown pooling around her. She looked at Ben with an expression he couldn't quite read. I don't know if I'm ready for this. For everyone to see me, to talk about me, to make assumptions about my life based on one dance. You don't have to do anything, Ben said firmly. You don't owe anyone your story, your pain, your survival. That's yours to keep or share as you choose. Emma, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, climbed into Clara's lap without asking permission, apparently deciding that this woman needed a hug, and Emma was going to provide it. Clara's arms came up automatically to hold her, and something in her expression softened. My mom died when I was 3, Emma said matter-of-factly. Daddy says she was brave and beautiful and strong. He says she fought really hard to stay, but sometimes you can't stay even when you want to. He says the bravest thing you can do is keep living even when living is hard. Clara's eyes filled with tears. She looked at Ben over Emma's head. You told her that? She asks about her mother sometimes, Ben said quietly. I try to give her answers that are honest, but not too heavy for a 9-year-old to carry. My friend Jessie's sister has a birthmark on her face, Emma continued, apparently on a roll now. Some kids are mean about it. They call her names and won't sit with her at lunch. I told Jessie that her sister is pretty and those kids are just scared. Scared of what? Clara asked. Scared of being different, Emma said, with the wisdom of someone who'd clearly thought about this a lot. Daddy says people are mean to different because different reminds them that they're not as special as they think they are. He says being kind to different is how you prove you're actually special. Richard made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. This kid should teach philosophy. She's 9, Ben said, but there was pride in his voice. And apparently wiser than most adults, Clara said. She hugged Emma tighter, then looked up at her father and Thomas. If we're going to do this, if we're going to use this attention for something good, we do it honestly. No sanitized version, no corporate messaging, no turning my pain into a marketing opportunity. We tell the truth, that cruelty is common and courage is rare, but both are choices. And we make it clear that one dance doesn't fix 3 years of trauma, doesn't erase the damage, doesn't make everything okay. But it's a start, Ben added quietly. Clara met his eyes and nodded. But it's a start. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conversations and decisions and plans. Richard's PR team was called in, apologetically, since it was nearly midnight, and began crafting a statement that would acknowledge the viral moment without exploiting it, that would center Clara's voice and experience without making her a spectacle. Thomas coordinated with the live stream production company to archive the footage in a way that would be accessible but not sensationalized. And Ben, somewhat reluctantly, agreed to a brief press statement that would establish his identity and military background while making clear that his privacy and Emma's privacy were to be respected. Through it all, Clara sat at the center of the activity with Emma still in her lap, the little girl having apparently decided that this was now her permanent position. She contributed to the discussion, approved or vetoed various approaches, and generally took control of her own narrative in a way she hadn't been able to do since the accident. It was nearly 2 a.m. when the last guests finally departed, when the catering staff began breaking down the buffet tables, when the orchestra packed up their instruments and the cleaning crew arrived to begin the massive task of restoring the ballroom to its normal state. Emma had fallen asleep an hour ago, curled up in one of the velvet chairs with her pink dress hiked up and her light-up sneakers still blinking faintly. Ben had draped his jacket over her like a blanket, and she slept with the abandon of children who feel completely safe. Clara stood at one of the tall windows, looking out at the hotel gardens below. The moon was bright enough to silver the carefully manicured lawns and flower beds, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the sound of the city that never quite went silent. She'd removed her heels hours ago, and without them she was several inches shorter, the hem of her gown dragging slightly on the marble floor. Ben approached quietly, not wanting to startle her. Long night. She smiled without looking away from the window. The longest. And the best, somehow. Which is strange because nothing about tonight should have been good, but it was. Sometimes the best moments come from the worst circumstances, Ben said. That's what makes them matter. Clara turned to face him, and in the dim light filtering through the windows, her scar was barely visible, just a slight shadow across her cheek. But she didn't turn away, didn't try to hide it. Can I ask you something? When you crossed that ballroom to ask me to dance, were you scared? Ben considered lying, then decided she deserved the truth. Terrified. I thought I'd be fired on the spot, probably escorted out by security. I thought everyone would laugh at me, or worse, laugh at you for accepting. I thought I might make everything worse instead of better. But you did it anyway. But I did it anyway, he confirmed, because sometimes you have to be scared and brave at the same time. They're not opposites. They're partners. Clara was quiet for a long moment, processing that. Then, my therapist has been telling me for 3 years that I need to engage with the world again, that hiding isn't healing, but I couldn't figure out how to take that first step, how to be brave enough to let people see me. See this. She touched the left side of her face lightly. Tonight you showed me how. You didn't make it small or manageable or safe. You just did it, jumped into the deep end and trusted that you'd figure out how to swim. And you jumped with me, Ben pointed out. That's the brave part. I offered a hand, but you had to choose to take it. Scared and brave at the same time, Claire repeated softly. I like that better than the version where you're supposed to stop being scared before you can be brave. Richard appeared from wherever he'd been coordinating the end-of-evening details, looking exhausted but more at peace than Ben had yet seen him. Car's ready when you are. I'll give you both a ride home. It's the least I can do. Ben glanced at Emma, still sleeping in her chair. I appreciate that. I'm not sure how I was going to get her home on the bus at 2 in the morning. Absolutely not, Richard said firmly. You're family now, and family doesn't take the bus at 2 in the morning. The word family hung in the air between them, too big and too important to acknowledge directly, but impossible to ignore. Ben felt something in his chest loosen, some knot of worry and fear that he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to be without it. He crossed to Emma and scooped her up carefully, jacket and all. She mumbled something incomprehensible and burrowed her face into his shoulder, not quite waking. Her light-up sneakers had finally run out of battery, and they hung limp and dark against his side. The four of them, Richard, Clara, Ben carrying Emma, made their way through the now quiet ballroom toward the service exit. As they passed the spot where Ben had first asked Clara to dance, she paused and looked back at the empty dance floor. "What are you thinking?" Ben asked. Clara smiled, and it reached all the way to her eyes, transforming her face. "That I'm going to learn to dance better, really dance, not just survive through it, because next time I want to enjoy it." "Next time," Richard repeated, and the hope in his voice was almost painful to hear. "You're planning a next time." "I'm planning lots of next times," Clara said firmly, "starting with your Christmas gala in December, and the New Year's Eve party, and whatever other events you need me at. I'm done hiding, Dad. I'm done letting them win." Richard pulled his daughter into a hug fierce enough that she squeaked in surprise. When he released her, his eyes were wet again, but this time the tears felt different, not grief, but something closer to joy. They emerged into the cool night air to find Richard's town car waiting, the driver holding the door open. Ben settled Emma into the back seat, buckling her in carefully, and she didn't even stir. Clara slid in next to her, and Emma immediately shifted in her sleep to rest her head on Clara's shoulder, apparently having decided that Clara was safe, and therefore suitable for sleeping against. Ben and Richard took the seats facing backward, and the car pulled away from the hotel into the city streets, mostly empty at this hour. For a while, no one spoke, each lost in their own thoughts about the evening, about what had changed and what it meant and what came next. "I'll need to explain to Emma why we're suddenly friends with billionaires," Ben said eventually. "She's going to have questions." "Tell her the truth," Clara suggested. "That sometimes people meet in unexpected ways, and sometimes those unexpected meetings turn into something important." "She'll probably want to know if we're going to be on TV," Ben said wryly. "We might be," Richard admitted. "The morning shows are already calling. They want interviews, human interest pieces, the whole thing. But we're not doing any of it without your consent, and we're definitely not putting Emma on camera unless she explicitly wants to be." Emma stirred at the sound of her name, lifting her head from Clara's shoulder and blinking sleepily. "Are we going home?" "We are, honey," Ben confirmed. "Mr. Lane is giving us a ride." Emma processed this, then looked at Clara with sleep-blurred eyes. "Did you have a good time at the fancy party?" Clara's smile was soft and genuine. "The best time. Thank you for my picture. I'm going to frame it and put it on my wall." "Really?" Emma perked up slightly. "Even though it's just crayon?" "Especially because it's crayon," Clara said. "It's perfect exactly the way it is." Emma, satisfied with this answer, settled back against Clara's shoulder and closed her eyes again. Within seconds, she was asleep. The car drove through the city, past buildings dark and bright, past streetlights that turned the night sodium yellow, past the evidence of other lives being lived in other ways. A late-night diner with a single customer, a delivery truck making its rounds, a couple arguing on a street corner. Ben watched it all pass by and thought about how much had changed in the space of a few hours. How one decision to cross a ballroom floor had somehow rewoven the fabric of multiple lives. He thought about tomorrow, about having to explain to his other employers that he'd be quitting, about Emma's reaction when she fully processed what had happened, about the practicalities of starting a new job that came with expectations and visibility he'd never sought. He thought about the military records that had apparently been found, about strangers reading about his service and his wounds, and making assumptions about who he was based on incomplete information. But mostly, he thought about the look on Clara's face when she'd said next time, the hope and determination in her voice, the way she'd transformed from someone hiding in a corner to someone planning her future. He thought about Richard's tears, about Mrs. Whitmore's apology, about Sarah's mother finding some small measure of peace in watching another scarred daughter reclaim her life. He thought about Emma's drawing, Daddy Dancing with a Princess, and how sometimes children understood the essential truth of things better than adults ever could. The car pulled up in front of Ben's apartment building, a modest structure in a neighborhood that was decent if not fancy, safe if not prestigious. The kind of place where people worked hard and looked out for each other and didn't ask too many questions about your business. "I'll walk you up," Richard said, and when Ben started to protest, he added, "Please, let me do this small thing." So Ben carried Emma, who had gotten heavier in the way that sleeping children somehow always did, while Richard and Clara followed him up 3 flights of stairs to his apartment. Ben unlocked the door one-handed and they stepped into the small space he and Emma called home. It was clean but cluttered in the way single-parent households often were, with Emma's school projects on the refrigerator, her books scattered across the coffee table, her jacket hanging on the back of a chair instead of on the hook by the door. The furniture was second-hand but well-maintained, the kind of pieces people gave away when they upgraded, and Ben had gratefully accepted and carefully refinished. He carried Emma to her room and tucked her into bed, removing her shoes but leaving her in the pink dress because trying to change her would wake her up. And sleep was more important than proper bedtime routines tonight. He pulled the covers up and kissed her forehead, and she mumbled, "Love you, Daddy," without waking. When he returned to the living room, he found Clara looking at the photographs on the wall, pictures of Emma at various ages, a few of Ben in uniform before the burns, one professional portrait of a beautiful woman with kind eyes who must have been Emma's mother. "She looks like her," Clara said softly. "Emma? Yeah, she does. Same smile, same attitude. Sarah would have loved to see her grow up." Ben's voice was steady, the grief old enough now that he could talk about it without breaking. "She would have loved tonight, too. Sarah always believed in doing the right thing, even when it cost you something." Richard was standing by the window, looking out at the street below. Without turning around, he said, "I'll have the employment contract drawn up Monday morning. Starting salary is $200,000 a year, full benefits, retirement matching, and a signing bonus to cover any immediate expenses. You'll have an office at Lane Industries headquarters, but most of your work will be out in the field with Clara." Ben's mind stuttered over the number. "200,000? "It's a senior security position," Richard said, finally turning around. "And frankly, you're worth more than that, but I don't want to insult you by making it seem like I'm buying your friendship. Consider it fair compensation for an important job." "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll start Monday," Richard said. "Say you'll help keep my daughter safe, not just physically, but emotionally, socially, in all the ways that matter." Ben looked at Clara, who was smiling at him with an expression that was equal parts hope and gratitude. He thought about Emma, asleep in the next room, and all the soccer games he'd missed, all the parent-teacher conferences he'd rushed to, all the times he'd juggled schedules and counted pennies, and wondered if he was doing enough, being enough, providing enough. He thought about dancing with a scarred girl in a ballroom full of people who'd forgotten how to be kind, and how sometimes the smallest acts rippled outward in ways you could never predict. "I'll start Monday," Ben said, "on one condition." "Name it." "Emma's school has a father-daughter dance in 3 weeks. Clara, if you're free, I'd like you to come. Show Emma, show all those kids, what courage looks like." Clara's eyes widened, then filled with tears. "You want me to go to an elementary school dance?" "I want you to go to every dance," Ben said simply. "To take up space in the world again. To show up and be seen and let people recognize what I saw tonight, that you're remarkable." I don't know if I can." "Scared and brave at the same time," Ben reminded her gently. "Remember?" Clara laughed through her tears and nodded. "Scared and brave at the same time. Okay. Yes, I'll be there." Richard watched this exchange with an expression of such profound gratitude that it was almost uncomfortable to witness. He cleared his throat roughly. "We should go. It's late, and you both need rest. Ben, someone from HR will call you Monday morning to handle the paperwork. Clara, we'll start coordinating security protocols tomorrow afternoon." As they moved toward the door, Clara paused and turned back to Ben. On impulse, she hugged him, a real hug, the kind that meant something, and whispered, "Thank you for seeing me." "Thank you for letting me," Ben replied. And then they were gone, and Ben was alone in his small apartment with his sleeping daughter and the lingering sense that his life had just been fundamentally reordered in ways he was still trying to process. He should have been tired. It was nearly 3 in the morning, but his mind was too busy to settle. He made himself a cup of tea and sat on the couch, thinking about everything that had happened, everything that was going to happen, all the ways that one dance had changed the trajectory of multiple lives. In her room, Emma slept peacefully, probably dreaming about fancy parties and tiny cakes and princesses who looked like Clara. And somewhere across the city, in a mansion that Ben had only seen on television, Richard Lane probably sat with his daughter and felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Hope for her future, confidence in her strength, belief in her ability to not just survive but thrive. Ben picked up his phone and pulled up the video that was apparently trending worldwide. He watched himself cross the ballroom floor, watched Clara's face transform from isolation to hope, watched them dance while the world looked on. The comments were overwhelmingly positive, full of people sharing their own stories of survival and courage, of choosing to be seen despite their scars. One comment in particular caught his attention. This is what love looks like. Not romantic love, but human love. The love that says, I see you suffering and I'm going to do something about it. More of this. Please, world, more of this. Ben set his phone aside and finished his tea. Today, actually, since it was well past midnight, would bring new challenges, new questions, new adjustments. But tonight had proven something he'd begun to doubt. That goodness still existed, that courage still mattered, that one person could still make a difference. He thought about the handkerchief in his pocket, the faded blue one with the embroidered initials TRL that had been weighing on him for 15 years. Soon, he would tell Richard the full story of how he'd received it, of what Thomas Lane had meant to him, of the debt he'd carried all these years. But that was a conversation for another time. For now, he just sat in his small apartment and felt grateful. For Emma, for unexpected opportunities, for the chance to help someone who needed help, for Clara's smile and Richard's tears, and the way the world could sometimes surprise you with its capacity for grace. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm. Inside, Ben Harper sat in the quiet and let himself believe, maybe for the first time in years, that everything was going to be okay. That sometimes survival was just the beginning, that sometimes the dance was only the first step, and that sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, the scars you carried could become the map that led you home. Monday morning arrived with the kind of bright autumn sunshine that made everything feel possible. Ben woke at 6, as he always did, but for the first time in years, the weight of exhaustion didn't immediately settle on his shoulders. Emma was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table in her school uniform, her hair still tangled from sleep, eating cereal while she watched the video of the dance on her tablet for what had to be the 15th time since Saturday night. You're going to wear that video out, Ben said, moving to start the coffee maker. You can't wear out videos, Daddy, Emma said without looking up. They're digital. Mrs. Chen told us in computer class. She took another bite of cereal, eyes glued to the screen. Jessica's mom saw this and told Jessica that you're a hero. Are you a hero? Ben poured water into the coffee maker, considering his answer. I'm just a dad who did what felt right. That's what heroes do, Emma said matter-of-factly. They do what's right even when it's hard. We learned that in social studies. She finally looked up from the tablet, her expression serious in the way only 9-year-olds could be serious. Is Clara going to be okay now because of the dance? I hope so, Ben said honestly. But one dance doesn't fix everything. It's going to take time. How much time? I don't know, honey. Healing isn't like baking a cake. There's no recipe that tells you exactly how long it takes. Emma thought about this while she chewed. Can we have cake for dinner tonight? To celebrate your new job? Ben smiled despite himself. We'll see. First, I have to actually start the job. The coffee maker beeped, and he poured himself a cup, adding the sugar and cream that made it barely recognizable as coffee. His phone had been buzzing intermittently since he'd woken up, text messages from people he hadn't heard from in years, friend requests from strangers, news outlets asking for interviews. He'd ignored most of it, but one message from Richard Lane sent at 5:30 that morning caught his attention. HR will call at 9 a.m. Take your time getting to the office. And Ben, welcome to the family. At 8:15, after dropping Emma at school and enduring the stares and whispers from other parents who'd apparently seen the video, Ben stood outside Lane Industries headquarters and tried to calm his racing heart. The building was a gleaming tower of glass and steel, 60 stories of corporate power rising into the autumn sky. He'd walked past it dozens of times, but never imagined he'd be entering through the front door as an employee. The lobby was all polished marble and modern art, with a security desk manned by 2 guards in crisp uniforms who looked like they could handle anything from lost visitors to armed intruders. Ben approached, suddenly aware of how out of place he looked in his only good suit, 5 years old and slightly tight across the shoulders. "Ben Harper," he said to the older of the 2 guards. "I'm supposed to—" "Mr. Harper, yes, sir." The guard's entire demeanor shifted, becoming almost deferential. "Mr. Lane left instructions. You're to go directly to the executive floor, 60th level. Ms. Chen from HR is expecting you." He handed Ben a temporary security badge. "Elevators are on your right. Welcome to Lane Industries." The elevator ride to the 60th floor felt like ascending into another world. Ben watched the numbers climb, watched the lobby grow smaller through the glass elevator shaft, watched the city spread out below him in all its complicated glory. His reflection in the polished steel doors showed a man trying very hard to look like he belonged here. The doors opened onto a reception area that was all understated elegance. Soft gray walls, expensive furniture that looked more like art than seating, floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the entire city. A woman in her 40s with kind eyes and an efficient air stood waiting. "Mr. Harper, I'm Susan Chen, VP of Human Resources. It's a pleasure to meet you." She extended her hand, and her handshake was firm and warm. "I have to say, that was quite the introduction to the company. We've received over 3,000 employment inquiries since Saturday night from people who want to work for an organization that values what you demonstrated." Ben felt his face heat. "I wasn't trying to make a statement about the company." "No, you were trying to help someone who needed help," Susan said, which made the statement more powerful than any PR campaign ever could. "Come, let's get your paperwork processed, and then Mr. Lane would like to see you." The next hour was a blur of forms and signatures, benefits elections and security protocols, background checks he'd already passed, and orientation materials he'd review later. Susan walked him through everything with patient efficiency, answering his questions and occasionally adding details about company culture, reporting structure, and the various resources available to employees. "You'll have an office on this floor," she explained as they walked down a hallway lined with glass-walled offices. "You'll report directly to Mr. Lane, which is unusual but makes sense given the nature of your role. Your primary responsibility is Miss Lane's security and well-being, but you'll also be consulted on broader security protocols and may be asked to advise on other matters where your perspective would be valuable." She stopped in front of an office that was larger than Ben's entire living room. "This is yours." Ben stared. The office had the same floor-to-ceiling windows as the reception area, offering an unobstructed view of the city. The furniture was modern and expensive. A large desk, comfortable chairs, a couch along one wall. There was even a small refrigerator and coffee maker in the corner. "This is too much," he said quietly. "This is what senior security personnel get," Susan corrected. "Mr. Lane believes that if you're going to protect his daughter, you deserve to be treated with respect and given the resources to do your job well." She gestured to the desk. "Your computer is already set up with all necessary access. It will stop by this afternoon to walk you through the security systems and communication protocols. Do you have any questions?" Ben had about 1,000 questions, but he settled on the most immediate. "When do I start actually working with Clara?" "This afternoon. She has a meeting with the board of Lane Industries at 2 o'clock. It's her first board meeting since the accident. Mr. Lane thought having you there would help her feel more confident." Susan's expression softened. "Between you and me, she's terrified. She's been avoiding any situation where she'd have to face her father's business associates. And now she's walking into a room full of people who've known her since she was a child and probably have opinions about everything from her appearance to her capabilities. That's a lot of pressure." "It is. Which is why you'll be there." Susan checked her watch. "Mr. Lane is expecting you now. His office is at the end of the hall. You can't miss it." Ben thanked her and made his way down the hallway, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet. He passed other offices, caught glimpses of people working, heard the muted sound of phone conversations and keyboard clicks. This was a world he'd never imagined being part of, a world of quarterly reports and strategic initiatives and decisions that affected thousands of lives. Richard Lane's office was less an office and more a command center. It occupied a corner of the building with windows on two sides offering panoramic views. The space was elegantly furnished but not ostentatious, with family photos mixed in among the business awards and framed magazine covers. Richard sat behind his desk, reading something on his computer screen, but he looked up immediately when Ben knocked on the open door. "Ben, come in. Please, close the door and sit." Richard stood and came around the desk, gesturing to the sitting area rather than the formal chairs facing his desk. "Coffee? Water?" "I'm fine, thank you." They sat, and for a moment Richard just looked at him, his expression unreadable. Then, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to really hear it. What you did Saturday night, asking Clara to dance, treating her with dignity and respect, showing her that she deserved to be seen, that changed something fundamental in my daughter. Yesterday, she called 3 of her college friends she hasn't spoken to in 2 years. She made plans to have lunch with them next week. She's terrified, but she's doing it anyway." Richard's voice roughened with emotion. "For 3 years, I've watched her disappear piece by piece, and I didn't know how to stop it. I threw money at the problem. The best therapists, the best doctors, the best everything, but nothing worked because the problem wasn't medical or psychological. It was human. She needed someone to treat her like a person again, and you did that. So thank you. Again. I'll probably thank you every day for the rest of my life." Ben shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, I appreciate that, but I need you to understand something. I'm not a miracle worker. I'm just a guy who made a decision in a moment. Clara's healing is going to take time and effort and probably some backsliding. There will be days when she doesn't want to face the world, when the courage feels too hard to maintain. I can support her through that, but I can't do it for her." "I know," Richard said. "I'm not expecting you to fix her. She's not broken. I'm expecting you to stand with her while she reminds the world of that." He leaned forward slightly. "The board meeting today is going to be difficult. Clara inherited her mother's shares in Lane Industries when she turned 25 last year, which makes her a voting board member. She's been attending meetings via video conference since the accident, but this will be her first in-person appearance. Some of the board members are genuinely supportive. Others—" He trailed off, his expression darkening. "Others have made comments about her capability, her fitness to hold her seat, whether her trauma makes her unreliable." "Who?" Ben's voice had gone flat and cold, the tone he'd used in the military when identifying threats. "Does it matter?" "It matters if I'm supposed to protect her from them." Richard smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "The primary concern is Gerald Hutchins, the CFO of one of our subsidiary companies. He's 68, old school, and he's made it clear he thinks Clara should sell her shares to me and let the men handle business. He's also the father of Marcus Drummond's business partner, and he was at the gala Saturday night. The one who called her a gargoyle. He didn't say it, but he laughed when his son did. I heard him." Richard's hands clenched into fists. "I would fire him, but he's technically an employee of the subsidiary, not Lane Industries directly, and he's got an ironclad contract. I'm working on it, but in the meantime, he'll be at the meeting today, and he will make Clara uncomfortable given the chance." "Then we don't give him the chance," Ben said simply. Richard studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Clara will be here at 1:30. The meeting starts at 2. I'll have someone show you the boardroom beforehand so you can familiarize yourself with the layout. Your role is to be present, to be a reminder to everyone in that room that Clara has someone in her corner, and to intervene if anyone crosses a line. Define crosses a line. Anything that makes her feel unsafe, unwelcome, or diminished. Use your judgment. I trust it more than I trust most of the people in that room." Ben left Richard's office with a growing sense that this job was going to be more complicated than he'd anticipated. He spent the rest of the morning familiarizing himself with the building, the security systems, the various protocols that governed a corporation the size of Lane Industries. He met with Thomas Chen, who gave him access to financial records and personnel files he'd need to understand the various players in Clara's world. He reviewed footage from previous board meetings, watching the dynamics, identifying the personalities, noting who spoke and who remained silent. By the time 1:30 arrived, he'd developed a preliminary assessment of the board. 12 members, 7 of whom seemed genuinely neutral or supportive of Clara, 4 who were questionable, and 1, Gerald Hutchins, who was actively hostile. Not terrible odds, but not great either. Clara arrived at 1:40, and Ben could see the tension in every line of her body. She wore a charcoal gray suit that was perfectly tailored and entirely professional, her hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the scar rather than hiding it. Her makeup was minimal, almost defiant in its simplicity. She looked like someone preparing for battle. "You came," she said when she saw Ben waiting outside the executive conference room. "Did you think I wouldn't? I thought maybe Saturday night was a moment of temporary insanity, and you'd realize what you'd signed up for and run screaming in the other direction." She tried to smile, but it came out shaky. "I'm terrified, Ben. I haven't been in a room with these people since before the accident. They've known me since I was a child, and now I have to walk in there with this face and pretend I deserve to be at that table." "You don't have to pretend," Ben said quietly. "You do deserve to be at that table. You own shares, you have a legal right to be there, and more importantly, you're brilliant. Your father told me about your MBA from Wharton, about the analysis you've been doing of the company's sustainability initiatives, about the proposals you've been working on. You belong there. Knowing it intellectually and feeling it emotionally are two different things. I know, which is why I'm going to be standing against the wall behind you, and every time you start to doubt yourself, you can look back and remember that at least one person in that room sees exactly who you are." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back fiercely. "I can't cry before a board meeting. That's rule number 1 of corporate professionalism." "Then think about something else. Think about Emma's drawing. Think about the father-daughter dance in 3 weeks. Think about all those people on social media sharing their stories because you gave them permission to be brave." She took a deep breath, held it, released it slowly. "Okay, I can do this." "Scared and brave," Ben reminded her. "Scared and brave," she repeated, and this time the smile was more genuine. They entered the boardroom together, and Ben immediately understood why Richard had wanted him to see it beforehand. It was an impressive space, a long table made of polished mahogany, high-backed leather chairs, a wall of windows overlooking the city, various screens and technological interfaces for presentations and video conferencing. 11 people were already seated, and they all turned to watch as Clara entered. The reactions varied. Some faces showed genuine warmth and welcome. Others were carefully neutral, professional masks giving nothing away. And one face, belonging to a man in his late 60s with silver hair and cold eyes, showed something that looked uncomfortably like contempt. Gerald Hutchins. Richard stood from his position at the head of the table. "Clara, welcome. Everyone, my daughter will be joining us in person from now on. I trust you'll all extend her the same courtesy and respect you would any board member." There was steel under his polite tone, a clear warning. Clara moved to an empty seat halfway down the table, and Ben took up position against the wall behind her, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough back to not be intrusive. He kept his posture relaxed but alert, his expression neutral, his eyes constantly scanning the room. The meeting began with the kind of procedural matters that made corporate governance simultaneously essential and mind-numbing. Approval of previous minutes, financial reports, routine business that required board oversight but rarely generated debate. Ben watched Clara more than he watched the presenters. She sat with perfect posture, made notes on a tablet, asked occasional clarifying questions that showed she'd read all the pre-meeting materials thoroughly. The trouble started 40 minutes in, when the discussion turned to a proposed expansion into Southeast Asian markets. "The initial investment is substantial," Richard was explaining, pulling up charts and projections on the main screen. "But the long-term growth potential is significant. We're looking at a 5-year timeline to profitability, with projected returns of—" "Excuse me," Gerald Hutchins interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from decades of speaking over people. "Before we commit to a multi-billion-dollar expansion, I'd like to understand the risk assessment more thoroughly. Specifically, I'd like to know who conducted it and what their qualifications are." Richard's jaw tightened slightly. "The assessment was conducted by our strategic planning division, overseen by Thomas Chen, with additional analysis from several board members who volunteered their expertise." "Which board members?" Gerald asked, though Ben suspected he already knew the answer. Clara contributed significantly to the risk analysis, Richard said evenly. Her background in international business and her fresh perspective proved invaluable. Gerald made a show of shuffling through papers, his expression skeptical. Forgive me, but given that Clara hasn't participated in person in any strategic planning meetings for 3 years, I'm concerned about whether she's sufficiently informed about our operational realities to be advising on matters of this magnitude. The room went silent. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. Ben saw Clara's shoulders tense, saw her hand tighten around her stylus. My qualifications, Clara said, and her voice was steady despite the tremor Ben could detect, include an MBA from Wharton with a concentration in international business, 3 years of remote participation in strategic planning where I've had access to all the same materials and data as any in-person participant, and approximately 800 hours of independent research into Southeast Asian market dynamics. She looked directly at Gerald, not flinching from his gaze. Would you like me to walk you through my methodology, or would you prefer to continue questioning my competence based on my physical presence rather than my actual work? Gerald's face flushed. I'm not questioning your competence, I'm questioning your… My what? Clara interrupted, and there was an edge to her voice now, something sharp and uncompromising. My ability to think clearly because I have a scar? My dedication because I've been working remotely? My understanding because I haven't been sitting in this room listening to you monopolize conversations? Clara, Richard said quietly, a warning or perhaps an encouragement. Ben couldn't tell which, but Clara wasn't finished. I've reviewed your comments from the last 12 board meetings, Mr. Hutchins. You've questioned my input 7 times. You've never once questioned Thomas's input, or Margaret's, or anyone else's, despite the fact that we all work from the same data. So either you have a problem with my analysis specifically, in which case I'd love to hear substantive criticism, or you have a problem with me personally, in which case this board should probably discuss whether personal bias is affecting your judgment. The silence that followed was absolute. Ben saw several board members exchange glances, saw Richard fighting to keep a smile off his face, saw Gerald Hutchins looking like he'd just been slapped. I resent the implication, Gerald started. And I resent being treated like I'm incompetent because I don't look the way you think board members should look, Clara shot back. But we don't always get what we want, do we? Margaret Chen, the board member who'd been silent through most of the meeting, leaned forward. I've reviewed Clara's risk assessment. It's thorough, well-researched, and honestly more comprehensive than what we've received for similar proposals in the past. I move that we approve the Southeast Asia expansion as proposed, with the understanding that Clara will continue to be involved in the implementation oversight. Second, said another board member immediately. Gerald looked like he wanted to object, but the mood in the room had shifted decisively against him. When the vote was called, the expansion passed 11-1, with only Gerald voting against. The rest of the meeting proceeded without incident, though Gerald remained notably quiet. When it finally ended nearly 2 hours after it began, Clara remained seated while the other board members filed out, several stopping to tell her how much they'd appreciated her analysis or how glad they were to see her in person. Gerald was one of the last to leave, and as he passed Clara's chair, he paused. For a moment Ben tensed, ready to intervene, but Gerald's voice when he spoke was tired rather than hostile. You're right, he said quietly, so only Clara, Ben, and Richard could hear. I have been treating you differently, and it's not because of your analysis. It's because… He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. My granddaughter was in a car accident 2 years ago. She survived, but she has a traumatic brain injury. Seeing you reminds me of her, of how much she's lost, and I've been taking out my grief and fear on you. That's not fair, and I apologize. Clara looked up at him, surprise evident on her face. I'm sorry about your granddaughter. She's getting the best care money can buy, Gerald said. But money can't fix everything, can it? He nodded to Richard, then to Ben, and left without waiting for a response. When the door closed behind him, Clara let out a breath that seemed to come from her toes. Did that just happen? Did I just face down Gerald Hutchins and win? You did, Richard said, and the pride in his voice was unmistakable. You were magnificent. I was terrified, Clara corrected. I'm still terrified. My hands are shaking. Look. She held them up, and indeed they were trembling visibly. Scared and brave, Ben said from his position against the wall. Clara laughed, slightly hysterical. Scared and brave and apparently capable of reading someone down in a board meeting. Who knew I had that in me? I did, Richard said simply. I've always known. I'm just glad you're finally letting yourself see it. The afternoon continued with Clara giving Ben a tour of the company, introducing him to key personnel, explaining various projects and initiatives she was working on. He was struck by her knowledge and passion, the way she lit up when talking about sustainability initiatives, or employee wellness programs, or the various ways Lane Industries could be more than just a profit-generating machine. They were in the company cafeteria, which was more like a high-end food court than a traditional cafeteria, when Clara's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it, and her expression shifted from contentment to anxiety so quickly that Ben immediately went on alert. What's wrong? It's from one of my college friends, Jamie. She saw the video, and she wants to meet for coffee tomorrow. Except she's suggesting this place downtown that's always crowded, always full of people who might recognize me, and I don't know if I'm ready for that yet. Do you want to see her? Yes. No, I don't know. Clara set her phone down, frustration evident. Before the accident, Jamie and I were close. We talked every day, went everywhere together, told each other everything. After the accident, I just stopped. Stopped answering her calls, stopped responding to her messages. I pushed her away because I couldn't handle seeing pity in her eyes, couldn't handle being the friend who'd changed, who'd become tragic instead of fun. And now? Now I want my friend back, but I'm scared she won't want me back. Not the way I am now. Clara's voice dropped to barely a whisper. What if I'm too different? What if I can't be the person she remembers, and she realizes she doesn't actually like who I've become? Ben was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to respond. After I came back from Kandahar, he said finally, I had to rebuild every friendship I'd had. Some people couldn't handle the scars, couldn't handle the nightmares, couldn't handle the fact that I wasn't the same guy who'd deployed. Those friendships ended, and it hurt. But some people, the real ones, they stuck around. They learned who I'd become and decided they liked that person too. Different, but still worth knowing. How do you know which kind Jamie is? You don't. Not until you try. But I'll tell you what my best friend from the military told me when I was struggling with the same question. If they can't handle you at your most real, they don't deserve you at your most polished. Real friends stay for the truth, not the performance. Clara picked up her phone again, staring at Jamie's message. Will you come with me, tomorrow? I mean, not to the coffee shop, that would be weird. But maybe you could wait nearby, just in case I need backup? Of course, Ben said without hesitation. That's what I'm here for. She smiled, genuine and grateful, and typed out a response to Jamie agreeing to meet. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and introductions, protocols, and procedures. By the time Ben left Lane Industries headquarters at 6 o'clock, his head was spinning with information, and his body was tired from the constant low-level alertness required when assessing potential threats in a new environment. But underneath the exhaustion was something else, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years, a feeling that he was doing something that mattered. Emma was at their neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment when he got home, a regular arrangement on days when Ben worked late. He collected her and listened to her excited chatter about her day, how her teacher had mentioned the viral video in class, how the other kids had asked her a million questions about the fancy party, how she'd told everyone that Clara was going to be her friend and they were all jealous. Can we call Clara? Emma asked as they entered their apartment. I want to tell her about my day. Honey, Clara's probably busy. His phone buzzed with an incoming video call. From Clara. Emma squealed with delight and grabbed the phone before Ben could stop her, answering the call with an enthusiasm that nearly knocked the device out of her hands. Clara, hi! Guess what happened at school today? Clara's face appeared on the screen and she was laughing. Hi, Emma. Tell me everything. For the next 20 minutes, Emma provided a detailed account of her entire day, complete with dramatic reenactments and sound effects. Clara listened with genuine interest, asking questions and making appropriate responses, and Ben watched them interact with a growing warmth in his chest. When Emma finally wound down, Clara said, Hey Emma, I have a question for you. Your dad said you're really good at making friends. How do you do it? Like, if you were scared someone might not like you, how would you be brave enough to try anyway? Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important questions. Well, you just have to remember that most people are nice on the inside, even if they're nervous on the outside. And if you're nervous and they're nervous, then you can be nervous together, which makes it less scary. And if they're mean, then they weren't worth being friends with anyway, so you didn't lose anything. That's very wise, Clara said softly. I'm very smart for 9, Emma agreed without modesty. Are you nervous about making friends? A little bit. I have to meet an old friend tomorrow, and I'm worried she won't like who I am now. Well, if she doesn't like you now, that means she wasn't a real friend before, Emma said with 9-year-old certainty. Real friends like you even when you change, like how Daddy likes me, even when I get taller and lose teeth and sometimes forget to clean my room. I love you even when you forget to clean your room, Ben corrected from off-screen. Same thing, Emma said dismissively. She leaned closer to the phone. Clara, do you want to come over for dinner sometime? Daddy makes really good spaghetti, and we could watch movies, and I could show you my room. Clara's eyes went suspiciously bright. I would love that. Maybe this weekend? Saturday, Emma declared. Saturday is perfect because there's no school the next day, so I can stay up late. After they ended the call and Emma went to wash up for dinner, Ben's phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Clara. Thank you for letting her call. I needed that more than you know. Your daughter is magic. He texted back. She likes you. That's her superpower, seeing the best in people. Then I'm lucky she sees it in me. Ben looked at the message for a long moment, then added, She's not the only one. Saturday arrived with unseasonable warmth, the kind of late October day that felt like summer's last gift before winter claimed the world. Ben cleaned the apartment with Emma's enthusiastic but largely unhelpful assistance, and they were both slightly frantic by the time Clara arrived at 6 o'clock carrying flowers for Emma and a bottle of wine for Ben. You didn't have to bring anything, Ben said, but he was touched by the gesture. My mother always said never arrive empty-handed, Clara replied. Even if it's just to a friend's apartment for spaghetti. Emma took Clara's hand and dragged her on a comprehensive tour of the apartment, showing her every toy, every drawing, every important possession in her 9-year-old life. Clara admired everything with genuine interest, asked questions, and made Emma feel like the most fascinating person in the world. Dinner was chaotic and perfect. Emma talked non-stop. The spaghetti was slightly overcooked, but no one cared, and Clara laughed more in 2 hours than she'd probably laughed in 3 years. She fit into their small family dynamic so naturally that by the time they settled on the couch to watch a movie Emma had chosen, Ben found himself thinking dangerous thoughts about permanence, about this becoming regular, about building something that looked like the future. Emma fell asleep halfway through the movie, her head in Clara's lap, and Clara's hand unconsciously stroked her hair with the gentleness of someone who'd been waiting for this kind of simple, domestic affection. She's wonderful, Clara whispered, careful not to wake Emma. She's the best thing I ever did, Ben agreed quietly. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the movie playing unnoticed, both of them content to simply exist in this moment. Finally, Clara said, I met Jamie yesterday. The coffee shop was crowded, just like I feared, and people stared and whispered, and some even took pictures. It was awful. Ben's protective instincts flared. Did anyone say anything to you? No. Actually, that's not quite true. Several people came up to tell me they'd seen the video, that they thought I was brave, that I'd inspired them. It was overwhelming, but in a good way. She looked down at Emma sleeping peacefully. Jamie cried when she first saw me. Not sad crying, happy crying. She said she'd missed me so much that she'd understood why I'd pushed her away, but it had broken her heart, that she'd been hoping for 3 years that I'd come back to her. Did you? Come back to her? I think so. We talked for 3 hours. Really talked, like we used to. About the accident, about her life, about everything I'd missed. She's engaged now, getting married next spring, and she asked me to be a bridesmaid. Clara's voice wavered slightly. I said yes. I'm terrified, but I said yes. Good, Ben said simply. I keep saying yes to things that scare me, Clara continued. The board meeting, coffee with Jamie, your daughter's school dance in 2 weeks. It's exhausting being this brave all the time. Then rest, Ben said. Courage doesn't mean never resting. It means resting and then getting up and trying again. Clara looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. How did you get so wise? I'm not wise. I just learned the hard way that hiding doesn't heal, and I had Emma to live for, which meant I couldn't afford to hide forever. I'm starting to understand that, Clara said quietly. The not hiding part. It's harder than I expected, but also better. Does that make sense? Perfect sense. They sat there until the movie ended, until Emma stirred and mumbled about needing to go to bed, until Clara reluctantly said she should probably head home. Ben walked her to the door, and she paused before leaving. Thank you, she said. For dinner, for Emma, for standing with me through all of this, for seeing me. Thank you for letting me, Ben replied, echoing what she'd said to him days earlier. She smiled, hugged him briefly, and left. Ben stood in his doorway and watched her walk down the hall toward the elevator, and thought about how sometimes healing looked like spaghetti dinners and children's laughter, and people choosing again and again to show up for each other. It looked like survival becoming life instead of just existence. It looked like scars that stopped defining and started just being. And it looked like family forming in unexpected ways, between unexpected people, built on nothing but recognition and respect and the shared determination to be brave, even when brave was hard. When he closed the door and carried Emma to bed, when he tucked her in and kissed her forehead, when he stood in his small apartment and felt the lingering warmth of Clara's presence, Ben Harper thought about the handkerchief still in his jacket pocket and knew the time was coming soon when he'd have to tell Richard the full story. But tonight, he just let himself feel grateful for second chances and new beginnings, and the way life sometimes surprised you with grace when you'd stopped expecting it. The 2 weeks that followed Saturday dinner passed in a rhythm that felt both new and strangely natural. Ben settled into his role at Lane Industries with the kind of focused determination he'd once brought to military operations, learning the landscape of corporate threats and social dynamics with the same attention to detail he'd once used to assess combat zones. Clara attended 3 more social events with Ben at her side, each one slightly less terrifying than the last, each one proving that she could exist in public spaces without crumbling. And Emma counted down the days to the father-daughter dance with an excitement that filled their apartment like helium, making everything feel lighter. On the Thursday before the dance, Ben was reviewing security protocols for an upcoming charity auction when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He almost sent it to voicemail, but something made him answer. "Is this Ben Harper?" The voice was male, older, with the rough quality of someone who'd spent years smoking or shouting or both. "Who's asking?" "My name is James Porter. I'm calling about my wife, Helen. She met you at the Lane Industries Gala a few weeks ago. You spoke to her in the ballroom. She told you about our daughter, Sarah." Ben's memory caught up, placing the name with the grieving mother who'd approached him, whose daughter had died in a car accident 5 years ago. "I remember. How can I help you, Mr. Porter?" "Helen passed away last Tuesday. Heart attack, sudden and massive. The doctor said it was quick, that she didn't suffer." James Porter's voice cracked slightly. "I'm calling because when I was going through her things, I found something she'd written the night after the gala. A letter. She wanted me to give it to you if anything happened to her." Ben's throat tightened. "Mr. Porter, I'm so sorry for your loss." "Thank you. Would it be possible to meet? I'd like to give you the letter in person." Helen was specific about that. Said it needed to be handed over, not mailed or emailed. Said some things required human contact. They arranged to meet the following morning at a coffee shop near Ben's apartment, and when Ben hung up, he sat staring at his phone for a long moment, trying to process the information. He'd spoken to Helen Porter for maybe 10 minutes, had offered nothing but presence and the space to tell her story about her daughter, and now she was gone, and she'd left him something. That night, he told Clara about the call during their now regular check-in conversation. She'd started calling him every evening around 8, ostensibly to debrief about the day, but really just to talk, to maintain connection, to not feel alone. It had become one of Ben's favorite parts of the day. "That's heartbreaking," Clara said when he finished explaining. "Do you think the letter is about Sarah?" "I don't know. James said Helen wrote it after the gala, so it must have something to do with that night." Ben paused, then added, "I keep thinking about what she said. That watching you dance made her feel like all the scarred, surviving daughters got a little braver. Maybe that's what the letter is about." "I didn't do anything," Clara protested. I just stood up and danced. That's not brave. It's just movement." "It's never just movement," Ben said quietly. "Not when movement requires courage. Not when standing up means something." Clara was silent for a moment, and Ben could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, could picture her in her apartment, probably curled up on her couch with tea and the book she was always reading. "The dance tomorrow," she said finally. "Emma's school dance. Are you nervous?" "Terrified," Ben admitted. "Not of the dance itself, but of all those parents seeing me with you, making assumptions, asking questions. Emma's excited enough that she told her entire class you're coming, which means every parent at that school knows. We're going to be on display." "We could cancel," Clara offered, but her voice lacked conviction. "We're not canceling. Emma's been planning her outfit for a week. She's made you a special name tag that says Clara, Emma's friend and Daddy's friend, and also a princess. She's written you into every story she tells. If we cancel now, it'll break her heart." "Then we don't cancel," Clara said firmly. "Scared and brave." "Scared and brave," Ben echoed, the phrase that had become their shared mantra. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, the weather finally remembering it was November. Ben met James Porter at the coffee shop at 9 after dropping Emma at school. The older man was easy to identify. He had the hollowed-out look of fresh grief, the kind of exhaustion that came from losing your person and having to figure out how to exist without them. They shook hands, and Ben bought them both coffee, and they sat in a corner booth away from the morning rush of customers. James pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, cream-colored and slightly worn, as if he'd been carrying it around for days, working up the courage to deliver it. "Helen was special," James said without preamble. "She had this way of seeing people, really seeing them. After Sarah died, she volunteered at support groups for parents who'd lost children. She'd sit with people in their worst moments and somehow make them feel less alone." He turned the envelope over in his hands. "The night of the gala, she came home different, lighter somehow. She told me about you dancing with that young woman, about how it had made her think about Sarah differently. Not about what Sarah lost, but about what she lived." He pushed the envelope across the table to Ben. "She wrote this at 3 a.m. I woke up and found her at the kitchen table, crying and writing. When I asked what she was doing, she said she was trying to capture something important before she forgot how it felt." His voice broke. 3 days later, she was gone. Heart attack while she was gardening. She loved gardening. Ben took the envelope with hands that weren't entirely steady. His name was written on the front in feminine handwriting that was slightly shaky, as if written in emotion or haste or both. "Thank you for bringing this to me. Thank you for giving my wife one last moment of peace," James said. "She spent 5 years drowning in grief, and you gave her a reason to swim, even if it was just for one night." After James left, Ben sat alone in the coffee shop for a long time, the envelope on the table in front of him, his coffee growing cold. Finally, he opened it and began to read. "Dear Ben, I don't know if we'll ever meet again, or if James will even find you to give you this letter. But I needed to write it anyway, needed to capture what I felt tonight before the feeling faded and I forgot that hope was possible. When Sarah died 5 years ago, part of me died with her. Not the obvious part. I kept breathing, kept moving, kept existing. But the part that believed in beauty and grace and the possibility that suffering could become something other than endless, that part died. I've been carrying her death like a stone in my chest, and it's been crushing me so slowly I didn't even realize I was suffocating. Tonight I watched you ask that young woman to dance, and something in me cracked open. Because what I saw wasn't charity or pity or performance. What I saw was recognition. You saw her pain and decided to stand with her in it, not to fix it or minimize it or make it easier, but just to acknowledge it and say, you're not alone. And watching them, watching her face transform from isolation to hope, watching the way she held herself differently after just one dance, I realized something I should have understood years ago. Sarah's death doesn't have to be the end of all beauty. Her scar, if she'd lived to carry it, wouldn't have been the end of her story. It would have been part of a larger story about survival and strength and the courage it takes to keep living when living is hard. I've been so focused on what Sarah lost that I forgot to celebrate what she was. She was brave and kind and full of light, and that light didn't disappear when she died. It's still here, in my memories, in the people she touched, in the way I choose to live in her absence. You reminded me of that tonight. You reminded me that scars, visible or invisible, don't make us less. They prove we survived something that tried to destroy us. And survival, real survival, is the most beautiful dance of all. I don't know what tomorrow brings. None of us do. But tonight, for the first time in 5 years, I feel like I can breathe again. Like maybe there's still beauty in the world, still grace, still moments worth living for. Thank you for that. Thank you for seeing someone who needed to be seen and choosing to act. Thank you for being brave enough to cross that ballroom when it would have been easier to look away. Thank you for showing me that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning to carry your grief while still making room for joy. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I hope it was peaceful. I hope James is okay. I hope he remembers to water my garden and feed the stray cat that lives in our backyard. But mostly, I hope he remembers what I'm going to tell him tomorrow. That loving someone means letting their memory make you kinder, not harder. Softer, not bitter. More alive, not less. Tell that young woman, Clara, I think her father called her, that she's doing better than she knows. Tell her that every time she shows up, every time she lets herself be seen, she's giving permission to everyone watching to be a little braver with their own scars. And tell your daughter, the one with the pink dress and the light-up shoes, that her daddy is a hero. Not because of what he did in the military, though I'm sure that was heroic too, but because he saw someone hurting and decided to help, even when helping was uncomfortable and risky and went against every social rule in that glittering ballroom. The world needs more people like you, Ben Harper. People who choose connection over comfort, who choose courage over convenience, who understand that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simple kindness. Thank you for reminding me what it means to be human. Thank you for giving me one last perfect memory. Thank you for existing in a world that desperately needs people like you. With gratitude and hope, Helen Porter. Ben read the letter 3 times, and by the third reading, his vision was blurred with tears he didn't bother to wipe away. He sat in that coffee shop booth and let himself grieve for a woman he'd barely known, but who had somehow seen straight through to the heart of what he'd been trying to do. Not just that night, but every day since Emma was born, since Sarah died, since he'd come back from Kandahar broken and had to figure out how to rebuild himself into something functional. He thought about Helen tending her garden, about James finding her there, about how death came sometimes without warning or mercy. He thought about how she'd spent her last days feeling lighter, feeling hope, because of one dance at one gala. And he thought about the responsibility that came with that, the responsibility to keep choosing connection, keep choosing courage, keep showing up even when showing up was hard. When he finally left the coffee shop, the letter carefully folded in his jacket pocket next to the handkerchief that carried its own weight of memory and obligation, Ben felt the full gravity of what he'd accidentally become. Someone people looked to for proof that kindness mattered, that courage was possible, that grace still existed in a world that often felt graceless. It was a heavier burden than he'd expected, but it was also, he realized, exactly what he'd been missing for years. A purpose that extended beyond survival, beyond just making it through another day. A reason to be brave that was bigger than himself. He drove to Lane Industries and went straight to Richard's office, bypassing the assistant who tried to tell him Richard was in a meeting. Richard took one look at Ben's face and dismissed the people in his office without explanation. "What happened?" Richard asked when they were alone. Ben told him about James Porter, about Helen's death, about the letter. He didn't read it aloud, it felt too private for that, but he conveyed the essence, that one dance had given a grieving mother a moment of hope, and that moment had sustained her until she died. Richard listened without interrupting, and when Ben finished, he was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "There's something I need to tell you, and I should have told you weeks ago. That handkerchief you have, the one with my brother Thomas's initials. I need to know how you got it." Ben's heart rate picked up. He'd been dreading this conversation, knowing it had to happen, but not knowing how to begin. Kandahar, 2010. I was part of a convoy that hit an IED. My vehicle flipped, caught fire. I was trapped inside, disoriented, burning. Captain Thomas Lane pulled me out, got me clear of the vehicle before it exploded. The blast threw us both. He took the worst of it, shielding me with his body. Richard's face had gone pale, his hands gripping the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles were white. He was conscious for maybe 5 minutes after, Ben continued, his voice rough with memory. Long enough to know he wasn't going to make it. He gave me the handkerchief, told me to find his family if I ever got the chance, told me to tell them he was proud of the work they were doing, proud of who they were. He said, Ben's voice broke. He said to tell his brother Richard to teach his daughter to be brave, because the world needed brave people. Richard made a sound that was half sob, half gasp. He said that? His exact words. He was lucid until the end, talking about you, about Clara, though she was just a baby then, about how much he loved you all, and how sorry he was that he wouldn't make it home. Ben pulled the handkerchief from his pocket and held it out. I've carried this for 15 years, trying to figure out how to return it, what to say. And then I walked into that ballroom and saw your daughter sitting alone. And I realized this was why. This was the moment Thomas was preparing me for. Richard took the handkerchief with shaking hands, running his thumb over the embroidered initials. We never knew what happened. The military said he died in combat, that it was quick, but they didn't have details. We've been imagining the worst for 15 years. He was a hero, Ben said quietly. Saved my life and 4 others that day. If he hadn't pulled me out of that vehicle, I wouldn't be here. Emma wouldn't exist. None of this, the dance, Clara's healing, any of it, none of it would have happened. He sent you to us, Richard whispered. 15 years ago, my brother sent you to my family because he knew somehow that we'd need you. Or maybe, Ben said gently, I needed you just as much. Maybe we all needed each other, and Thomas was wise enough to see it even in his last moments. Richard stood abruptly and pulled Ben into a fierce embrace, the kind of hug that men give each other when words fail, when grief and gratitude become too big for language. They stood like that for a long moment, Richard crying openly now, Ben holding him up the way Thomas had once held Ben up, the way people held each other when the weight of being human became too much to carry alone. When they finally separated, Richard wiped his eyes roughly and said, Clara needs to know. She needs to know that you knew Thomas, that he's part of why you're here. Are you sure? I don't want to make this about me, or about him. This is about her healing, not about old debts. This is about all of it, Richard corrected. About how people are connected in ways we can't see. About how one act of courage, Thomas saving you, you asking Clara to dance, ripples out in ways we can't predict. She needs to know that the man standing with her is the man her uncle saved. That courage is hereditary, passed from person to person like a gift. They told Clara that afternoon in Richard's office with the door closed and the late November sun slanting through the windows. Ben recounted the story again, every detail he could remember about Thomas. His courage, his humor even in the worst moment, his final words about being proud of his family. Clara listened with tears streaming down her face, and when Ben finished, she crossed the room and took both his hands in hers. My uncle sent you to us, she said, echoing her father's words. He saved you so you could save me. You're saving yourself, Ben said. I'm just standing with you while you do it. No, Clara said firmly. We're saving each other. All of us. You, me, Dad, Emma, everyone who's been touched by what happened at the gala. We're all saving each other, piece by piece, moment by moment. That's what courage looks like. Not one big heroic act, but 1,000 small choices to show up for each other. That evening, Ben went home and told Emma a simplified version of the story. That he'd known Clara's uncle a long time ago, that her uncle had been a hero, that sometimes people are connected in surprising ways. Emma listened with the intense focus she brought to all important stories, and when he finished, she said, So we're like a family now? You and me and Clara and Mr. Lane. Something like that, Ben agreed. Good, Emma said with satisfaction. I like our family, even if it's a weird family. All the best families are weird, Ben assured her. The next day was Saturday, the day of the father-daughter dance at Emma's school. Ben woke early, nerves already humming through his system. Emma was too excited to eat breakfast, bouncing around the apartment in her carefully chosen outfit, a purple dress she'd picked out specifically for the occasion, with matching purple shoes and a sparkly headband that threatened to slide off her head every few seconds. When is Clara coming? Emma asked for the 10th time in as many minutes. 6 o'clock, just like I told you. We don't have to be at the school until 7. But what if she forgets? She won't forget. She's as excited about this as you are. This turned out to be true. Clara arrived at exactly 6 o'clock, and Emma's squeal of delight could probably be heard 3 floors down. Clara was dressed more casually than Ben had ever seen her. Dark jeans, a soft blue sweater, her hair down and loose around her shoulders. She looked younger this way, less like a billionaire's daughter and more like someone Emma's age who'd just gotten really tall. You look beautiful, Emma declared, grabbing Clara's hand. Look, we match. You're wearing blue and my dress has blue flowers, see? Clara bent down to examine the flowers with appropriate seriousness. So we do match. That's perfect. Everyone will know we're together. The drive to the school was filled with Emma's constant chatter, her excitement making it impossible for either adult to get a word in. By the time they pulled into the parking lot, Ben's nerves had transformed from general anxiety into specific dread as he saw the number of cars already there, the number of families streaming into the gymnasium, the number of opportunities for something to go wrong. Clara must have sensed his tension because she reached over and squeezed his hand briefly. We've got this, she said quietly. Scared and brave. The school gymnasium had been decorated with streamers and balloons, with a DJ setting up in one corner and tables of snacks along one wall. The lighting was dimmed slightly, giving the space a party atmosphere, and already dozens of father-daughter pairs were scattered around the room, some dancing, some eating, some just talking and laughing together. They entered, and Ben felt the exact moment when people recognized them. It started with one parent nudging another, then whispers spreading like ripples in a pond, then outright stares. Within minutes, half the room was watching them, and Ben felt Clara's hand tighten on Emma's shoulder. Everybody's looking, Emma observed with a 9-year-old's brutal honesty. Then let's give them something worth looking at, Clara said, and her voice was steady despite the anxiety Ben could see in her eyes. Let's dance. They made their way onto the dance floor, and the DJ, who'd apparently been briefed by someone, put on a slower song that was age-appropriate but still romantic. Emma took Clara's hands and began spinning in circles, completely unself-conscious, her purple dress twirling out around her. Clara laughed and spun with her, and gradually other girls began joining them, drawn by Emma's infectious enthusiasm. Ben stood at the edge of the dance floor, watching his daughter dance with the woman who'd somehow become essential to their lives in just a few weeks, and felt his throat tighten with emotion. This was what family looked like. Not blood relation or legal connection, but choice. Choosing to show up for each other, choosing to be brave together, choosing connection over comfort. A woman approached him, mid-40s with kind eyes and an uncertain smile. You're Ben Harper. I am, Ben confirmed, bracing himself. I'm Michelle Torres, Jessica's mom. Emma talks about you all the time, about the gala, about Clara, about how brave you both are. She hesitated, then continued. My husband left us 2 years ago. Just walked out one day, decided fatherhood was too hard, family was too much commitment. Jessica has a school dance coming up in the spring, and she's been dreading it because she doesn't have a dad to take her. Ben's heart clenched. I'm sorry. That must be incredibly difficult. It is. But watching you with Emma, watching Clara with all these girls, it reminded me that family isn't always about biology. It's about who shows up. And I was wondering, she took a breath. Would you be willing to talk to some of the other single moms here? Share how you make it work, give them hope that their daughters can still have these moments, even without traditional father figures. Before Ben could respond, another parent appeared, then another. Within 10 minutes, he was surrounded by a small group of single mothers, all with similar stories, all looking for guidance or reassurance, or just someone who understood what it meant to parent alone. Ben talked to them honestly about the struggles, the exhaustion, the guilt, the constant fear that he wasn't doing enough, but also about the rewards, about Emma's resilience, about how kids were often stronger than adults gave them credit for. While Ben was occupied with the parents, Clara found herself surrounded by a crowd of girls who all wanted to know about the dress she'd worn to the gala, about being on TV, about what it felt like to be famous. She answered their questions patiently, but then one girl, maybe 10 years old with glasses and serious eyes, asked the question Clara had been dreading. Does your scar hurt? The room seemed to go quiet, all the adults within earshot tensing, waiting to see how Clara would respond to a child's tactless curiosity. Clara knelt down so she was at the girl's eye level. Not anymore. It did when it first happened, but now it's just part of my face, like freckles or dimples or anything else that makes people look different from each other. My brother has a birthmark on his neck, the girl said. Kids are mean about it sometimes. They call him names. That must hurt his feelings. It does. He cries about it sometimes when he thinks I'm not listening. The girl touched the left side of Clara's face gently, the way Emma had weeks ago. But you're not hiding yours. Why not? Clara thought about how to answer, how to explain something she was still figuring out herself. Because hiding it means letting the people who are mean win. It means agreeing with them that I should be ashamed, and I decided I don't want to be ashamed anymore. I want to be brave instead. Even when it's scary? Especially when it's scary, Clara confirmed. That's what makes it brave. The girl considered this, then nodded seriously. I'm going to tell my brother that, about being brave even when it's scary. Other girls pressed closer, each with their own stories of being different, of being hurt, of struggling to be brave. Clara listened to all of them, offered what comfort and wisdom she could, and realized something profound. By letting herself be seen, by choosing courage over comfort, she'd accidentally given these children permission to be brave with their own struggles. The evening progressed, and the initial awkwardness faded into something more genuine. Parents stopped staring and started approaching with kindness, with gratitude, with their own stories of struggle and survival. Girls stopped treating Clara like a celebrity and started treating her like a friend, someone safe to confide in, someone who understood what it meant to be different. Emma, in her element with all this attention, flitted from group to group like a purple butterfly, introducing Clara to everyone, making sure no one felt left out, conducting the social dynamics with the unconscious skill of someone who'd never learned to see barriers between people. Near the end of the evening, the DJ announced the last dance, a special father-daughter number that would close out the event. Ben found Emma and held out his hand formally, making her giggle. "May I have this dance, Miss Harper?" "You may, Daddy," Emma said with exaggerated politeness, then immediately abandoned the formality by jumping into his arms. They danced, Emma's arms around his neck, her head on his shoulder, her light-up shoes flashing against the dim gymnasium floor. Around them, other father-daughter pairs swayed to the music, each lost in their own moment, each creating memories that would sustain them through whatever came next. Clara stood at the edge of the dance floor, watching them, feeling simultaneously part of the moment and separate from it. She was smiling, genuinely happy for them, but there was an ache in her chest, for her own father, for the uncomplicated relationship they'd had before the accident complicated everything, for the lost years when she'd been too afraid to let him close. As if summoned by her thoughts, her phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "How's the dance?" She typed back, "Perfect and heartbreaking. I see Emma with Ben and remember being that age with you before everything got complicated." His response came quickly. "Nothing's too complicated to fix. Come home after the dance. Let's talk." When the song ended and the event concluded, when Emma was saying elaborate goodbyes to every single person in the gymnasium, a mother approached Clara with a shy smile. "Thank you for coming tonight. My daughter Sarah, not the Sarah you met, different Sarah, has been struggling with anxiety since her grandmother died. She barely speaks at school, won't participate in activities, but tonight she talked to you for 20 minutes about her feelings. That's more than she shared with us in 6 months. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm glad I could help." "You did more than help. You showed her that it's okay to be vulnerable, okay to show your struggles, okay to be human instead of perfect. That's a gift most adults can't give, let alone someone you just met." The drive home was quiet, Emma having exhausted herself with excitement and fallen asleep in the back seat almost immediately. Clara sat in the passenger seat staring out the window at the city lights, processing everything that had happened. "Thank you for coming," Ben said quietly, not wanting to wake Emma. "She'll remember this night for the rest of her life." "So will I," Clara said. "Thank you for letting me be part of it." They dropped Clara at her apartment building, and Ben walked her to the lobby despite her protests that it wasn't necessary. As they said goodbye, she hugged him tightly, holding on a moment longer than casual friendship would require. "My dad wants to talk," she said when she pulled back. "About fixing things between us, about not letting the past stay complicated. I think I'm finally ready for that conversation." "Good," Ben said simply. "He's been ready for 3 years. He's just been waiting for you." "I know," Clara whispered. "That's what makes it harder. Knowing he's been patient, been kind, been everything a father should be, and I've been too afraid to let him all the way in." "Then let him in tonight. Let him see what I see, that you're healing, that you're strong, that you're ready to stop hiding." Clara nodded, wiped her eyes, and headed toward the elevator. Ben watched until the doors closed, then returned to his car where Emma was still sleeping peacefully, her purple dress wrinkled, her sparkly headband askew, her face showing complete contentment. He drove home through the quiet city streets, thinking about Helen Porter's letter, about Thomas Lane's sacrifice, about all the ways that courage passed from person to person like a torch, illuminating the darkness for whoever came next. He thought about Clara going to talk to her father, about Emma sleeping peacefully because she felt safe and loved, about how sometimes the best thing you could do for people was just show up consistently and let them lean on you when they needed support. That night, after carrying Emma to bed and tucking her in still wearing her purple dress because he didn't have the heart to wake her, Ben sat in his living room and thought about everything that had changed in the past month. He'd gone from 3 part-time jobs and constant exhaustion to a career that actually meant something, from loneliness to connection, from just surviving to actually living. He thought about Thomas Lane pulling him from a burning vehicle 15 years ago, about how that single act of courage had rippled forward through time to create this moment. Emma sleeping peacefully, Clara healing gradually, Richard finding hope again, Ben himself discovering that life after trauma could be rich and meaningful if you were brave enough to reach for it. And he thought about Helen Porter's words, "Survival, real survival, is the most beautiful dance of all." She'd been right. Survival wasn't just about making it through the hard moments. It was about what you did with the time you'd been given, how you chose to use your second chances, who you decided to become after life tried to destroy you. It was about dancing even when you were scared, about standing with people who needed standing with, about choosing connection over comfort, courage over convenience, grace over the easy cruelty of looking away. It was about being human in the fullest sense, flawed and frightened and brave anyway. His phone buzzed with a text from Clara. "Talked to Dad, really talked, for hours, cried together, made promises to do better. Thank you for pushing me to be brave." He texted back, "You did that yourself. I just stood next to you while you figured it out." Her response came quickly. "That's all anyone really needs, someone willing to stand next to them. Thank you for being that person." Ben looked at the message for a long time, then set his phone aside and let himself feel the full weight of gratitude for this strange, unexpected family he'd somehow found. For Emma, who reminded him every day why survival mattered. For Clara, who was learning to be brave. For Richard, who'd lost a brother but gained someone who remembered Thomas's sacrifice. For all the broken, healing, courageously surviving people who'd entered his life and shown him that scars, visible or invisible, didn't make you less. They proved you'd survived something that tried to destroy you. And survival, Ben had learned, was its own kind of victory, its own kind of grace, its own kind of dance. He sat in his apartment and felt grateful for second chances, for unexpected connections, for the way life sometimes surprised you with beauty when you'd stopped expecting it. And he thought about tomorrow, about all the tomorrows ahead, and felt ready to meet them. Scared, maybe, but brave anyway. Always brave anyway. 3 weeks after the father-daughter dance, on a Tuesday morning that carried the first real bite of winter, Ben arrived at Lane Industries to find Richard waiting for him in the lobby. The CEO looked uncharacteristically uncertain, holding 2 cups of coffee and shifting his weight from foot to foot in a way that suggested he'd been standing there for a while. "Walk with me," Richard said without preamble, handing Ben one of the coffees. "There's something I need to show you." They left the building and walked through the nearby park, bare trees reaching into a gray sky that threatened snow. Richard was quiet for several blocks, and Ben didn't push, had learned over the past month that Richard needed time to organize his thoughts before speaking them aloud. Finally, standing beside a fountain that had been drained for winter, Richard said, "After Thomas died, my father created a foundation in his name, the Thomas Lane Foundation for Military Families. It provides support for veterans and their children, scholarships, counseling, financial assistance, whatever they need. It's been running for 14 years, has helped thousands of families." He paused, took a sip of coffee. "I want you to run it." Ben nearly choked on his own coffee. "What?" "The current director is retiring in 3 months. I've been trying to figure out who should take over, who would understand the mission deeply enough to honor what Thomas believed in. And then you walked into my life carrying his handkerchief and embodying every value he died protecting." Richard turned to face Ben directly. "You understand what these families are going through because you've lived it. You understand sacrifice because you've made it. And you understand that sometimes the best way to honor the dead is to help the living. That's exactly what the foundation needs." "Richard, I just started my current job. I'm finally getting the hang of corporate security, finally feeling like I know what I'm doing." "This would be a promotion," Richard interrupted. "Higher salary, full autonomy, your own staff. You'd still work closely with Clara. The foundation frequently partners with Lane Industries on various initiatives. But you'd have your own mission, your own purpose. You could build something that matters, help people who need exactly what you needed when you came home from Kandahar." Ben stared at the empty fountain, his mind racing. "Can I think about it?" "Take all the time you need. But Ben, I've watched you for the past month. You're good at security work, but you're extraordinary at connecting with people, at seeing what they need and figuring out how to provide it. The foundation would let you do that on a scale that could change thousands of lives." They walked back to the building in companionable silence, and Ben spent the rest of the morning distracted, his mind turning over Richard's offer from every angle. The work would be meaningful in ways that went beyond protecting one person, but it would also mean less daily contact with Clara and Emma's growing attachment to her. He was still wrestling with the decision when Clara appeared in his office doorway at noon. "Lunch?" she asked, and something in her expression suggested this wasn't a casual invitation. They went to a small restaurant 3 blocks from Lane Industries, the kind of place where executives didn't usually eat, and therefore they could have a relatively private conversation. After they ordered, Clara folded her hands on the table and looked at him with an intensity that made Ben nervous. "My father offered you the foundation job." "How did you—" "He tells me everything now. We promised each other after our talk. No more secrets, no more careful distance, no more protecting each other by withholding information." She smiled slightly. "It's been an adjustment, but a good one. Anyway, he told me what he offered you, and I have something to say about it." Ben braced himself for her to ask him not to take it, to stay in his current role where they saw each other daily, where the relationship they'd built could continue exactly as it was. Instead, she said, "You should take it." "What?" "You should take the job. It's perfect for you, Ben. I've watched you light up when you talk about your military service, about the people you served with, about what you learned during that time. And I've watched you be merely competent at security work because you're doing it for me, not because it feeds something essential in you." She reached across the table and took his hand. "You saved me by asking me to dance. Let me save you back by telling you that you deserve work that fulfills you, not just work that pays well." "But the foundation would mean I'm not with you every day, not available when you need support. Ben, I've been going to therapy twice a week since the gala. I've reconnected with 6 of my college friends. I've attended 4 public events without having panic attacks. I'm healing, actually healing, and part of that healing is learning I don't need a security blanket anymore. I need friends, support, connection, and those things don't require you to sacrifice your own purpose." Their food arrived, and they ate in silence for a few minutes while Ben processed what she'd said. Finally, he asked, "What if I take the job and you backslide? What if there's another Marcus Drummond at some event and I'm not there to stand with you?" Clara smiled, and there was steel underneath the warmth. "Then I'll handle it myself, because that's what I've been learning, Ben. How to be my own protector, my own advocate, my own source of courage. You gave me permission to be brave. Now I need to practice being brave on my own." "You're sure?" "Completely. Take the job. Help those families. Honor Thomas by doing work that matters. And trust that the foundation we've built, you, me, Dad, Emma, is strong enough that it doesn't require daily maintenance to survive." When Ben returned to the office that afternoon, he went directly to Richard's office and accepted the position. The relief and joy on Richard's face made it clear he'd been worried Ben would decline, and they spent the next 2 hours discussing the transition, the Foundation's current programs, and Ben's vision for where he wanted to take it. That evening, Ben sat Emma down for a serious conversation about the job change, expecting confusion or resistance. Instead, she said, "Does this mean you'll be helping kids like me? Kids whose parents were in the military?" "Yes, exactly like that." "Then you have to do it, Daddy, because lots of kids don't have someone like Clara helping them. They need you." She thought for a moment. "Can I help too, when I'm old enough?" Ben pulled her into a hug, his heart so full it physically ached. "When you're old enough, you can do anything you want, including helping at the Foundation." The next month passed in a blur of transition and preparation. Ben spent his mornings with the outgoing Foundation director, learning the programs and meeting the staff. His afternoons were still dedicated to Clara, attending events and meetings, maintaining the relationship they'd built while gradually stepping back to let her stand on her own. And his evenings belonged to Emma, who was counting down to Christmas with the kind of excitement that made their apartment feel perpetually full of anticipation. 2 weeks before Christmas, Richard hosted a small dinner party at his home, not the massive mansion Ben had imagined, but a comfortable brownstone in an old neighborhood where money bought privacy rather than ostentation. The guest list was intimate: Ben and Emma, Clara, Thomas Chen and his wife, and Susan Chen from HR, who turned out to be Thomas's sister. They ate around a table that seated 8 comfortably, and the conversation flowed easily, naturally, like family rather than colleagues. After dinner, while the adults were having coffee and Emma was showing Thomas's wife her latest drawings in the other room, Clara stood and tapped her glass gently to get everyone's attention. "I need to say something," she began, and her voice was steady but emotional. "5 weeks ago, I was sitting in a ballroom full of people who'd written me off as broken, as less than, as someone to pity or mock. I was drowning in plain sight, and I'd convinced myself that was just how life was going to be from now on. That the accident had ended not just my old life, but any possibility of a new one." She looked at Ben, her eyes shining. "And then a waiter crossed a ballroom floor and asked me to dance. And everything changed. Not just that night, but every day since. Because Ben didn't just give me one dance. He gave me permission to exist fully again, to take up space, to be seen without apologizing for being scarred." "Clara," Ben started, but she held up a hand. "Let me finish. I've spent the last month thinking about what that moment meant, what it sparked, all the ways that one act of courage rippled outward. Ben, you know about the hashtag, about how millions of people shared their own stories of survival because they watched us dance. But you don't know about the letters." She picked up a folder from the sideboard and opened it. "These are just some of them. Letters from people around the world telling me how that night changed something for them. A woman in Australia who'd been hiding her burn scars for 20 years wore a sleeveless dress to her daughter's wedding. A man in Japan who'd been suicidal after a disfiguring accident decided to keep living. A teenager in Brazil who was being bullied for her birthmark stood up to her tormentors and demanded respect." Clara's voice broke slightly. "Hundreds of letters, maybe thousands by now. All because you decided that my pain mattered enough to do something about it. All because you chose connection over comfort." She pulled out one more piece of paper. "This one came last week. It's from a support group for survivors of traumatic injury, and they've started something called the Harper Initiative, programs in hospitals around the country where they bring in speakers who've survived visible trauma to talk to recent injury patients about what life looks like after the initial crisis. They're naming it after you, Ben. After your courage." Ben felt like he couldn't breathe. "I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just asked someone to dance." "You did the most extraordinary thing possible," Clara corrected. "You saw someone suffering and decided their dignity mattered more than your comfort. In a world that teaches us to look away, you looked directly at pain and said, 'I see you, and you matter.' That's revolutionary." Richard stood, his own eyes wet. "My brother saved your life 15 years ago, Ben, and you've spent the last month returning that favor, not just to my daughter, but to my entire family. You've given us back something we'd lost. Hope that kindness still exists, that courage still matters, that one person can still make a difference." He raised his glass. To Ben Harper. To doing the right thing even when it's hard. To seeing people who need to be seen. To carrying forward my brother's legacy in ways I never imagined possible. Everyone raised their glasses, and Ben had to blink hard to clear his vision. Emma came running back into the room, drawn by the sound of the toast, and climbed into Ben's lap without asking permission. "Why is everyone crying?" she asked with a 9-year-old's confusion about adult emotions. "Because we're happy," Clara said, reaching over to ruffle Emma's hair. "Sometimes people cry when they're really, really happy." "That's weird," Emma pronounced. "But okay." She looked up at Ben. "Daddy, can we tell them now?" Ben had almost forgotten. "Oh, right. Emma has an announcement." Emma straightened in his lap, suddenly serious. "Clara, my class is doing a thing where we bring someone special to school to talk about being brave. And I want you to come talk to my class about your scar, and about dancing even when you're scared." The room went silent. Clara stared at Emma, clearly not having expected this. "Emma, I don't know if I'm the right person." "You're exactly the right person," Emma interrupted with the certainty only children possess. "Because you're brave even though being brave is hard. That's what makes it count. And all the kids in my class know about you from the dance video, and they want to meet you, and Mrs. Patterson said it would be educational." Clara looked helplessly at Ben, who just shrugged. "It's your choice. But for what it's worth, I think you'd be amazing at it." "What would I even say?" "The truth," Ben said simply. "That courage isn't about not being scared. It's about being scared and showing up anyway. That scars don't make us less. They prove we survived. That every day we choose to be seen is a victory worth celebrating." Clara was quiet for a long moment, and Ben could see her wrestling with fear and hope in equal measure. Finally, she looked at Emma and said, "Okay, I'll do it. When?" Emma's face lit up like Christmas morning. 2 weeks, right before winter break. It's going to be so good, Clara. All the kids are going to love you." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Ben caught Clara's eye across the table and mouthed, "Proud of you." She smiled back, and in that smile was everything they'd both learned over the past 6 weeks. That healing wasn't linear, that courage was a practice rather than a destination, that the people who saw you at your most vulnerable and chose to stay were the people worth keeping. After dinner, after Emma had fallen asleep on Richard's couch and been carried to the car still wearing her fancy dress, after goodbyes had been said and promises made to do this again soon, Ben drove through the city with his sleeping daughter in the back seat and thought about how profoundly his life had changed. 2 months ago, he'd been cobbling together 3 jobs to make rent, exhausted and lonely and convinced that this was just how life after trauma looked, manageable but joyless, functional but not fulfilling. And now he had meaningful work that honored Thomas's memory, had a found family that felt more real than some blood relations, had a daughter who was learning that kindness mattered and courage was always possible. He thought about Helen Porter's letter, about how she'd written that survival was the most beautiful dance of all. And he understood now what she'd meant, that the real beauty wasn't in the single moment of asking Clara to dance, wasn't in the viral video or the media attention or any of the external validation. The beauty was in all the moments that came after, in the daily choice to keep showing up, keep connecting, keep being brave even when brave was exhausting. The beauty was in Clara going to Emma's school despite her fear, in Richard learning to see his daughter's strength instead of her scars, in Emma growing up with examples of courage that would shape who she became, in all the people around the world who'd watched one dance and decided to be a little braver with their own struggles. The beauty was in the ripples, in the way that one act of courage spread outward like light, illuminating darkness for people you'd never meet, in places you'd never go, in ways you'd never fully understand. 2 weeks later, on a cold December morning with snow threatening but not yet falling, Ben took the afternoon off from the foundation to attend Clara's talk at Emma's school. He sat in the back of the classroom while 23 third graders stared at Clara with the kind of unfiltered curiosity that adults had learned to hide. Clara stood at the front of the room, and Ben could see her hands trembling slightly, could see the way she kept touching her scar, unconsciously, old habits dying hard. But her voice when she spoke was steady. "Emma asked me to come talk to you about being brave," she began. And I thought about what to say for a long time because I'm not sure I'm the right person to teach anyone about bravery. Most days, I'm still figuring it out myself. She touched her scar again, this time deliberately. 3 years ago, I was in a car accident. My best friend died, and I got this scar. And for a long time, I thought the scar was the worst thing that could happen to me. I thought it made me ugly, made me less than I was before, made me someone people wouldn't want to know. The children were completely silent, listening with the intensity they usually reserve for stories about dragons or superheroes. I was wrong, Clara continued. The scar wasn't the worst thing. The worst thing was letting other people's cruelty make me hide. The worst thing was believing that being different meant being less. The worst thing was giving up on myself before giving other people the chance to see who I really was. She smiled slightly. And then something amazing happened. A man I didn't know, Emma's dad, saw me sitting alone at a fancy party, saw how sad and scared I was, and he decided to do something about it. He asked me to dance, and that one small act of kindness changed everything because it reminded me that I got to choose. I could choose to hide forever, or I could choose to be brave. A girl in the front row raised her hand. But how do you be brave when you're really, really scared? You be scared and brave at the same time, Clara said. Those two things aren't opposites, they're partners. Courage doesn't mean you're not afraid, it means you're afraid and you do the thing anyway. Another hand went up. Do people still say mean things about your scar? Sometimes, Clara admitted, but here's what I've learned. People who say mean things are usually scared themselves. They're scared of being different, scared of pain, scared of anything that reminds them that bad things can happen. And their fear makes them cruel. But their cruelty doesn't have to define me. I get to define me. For the next 40 minutes, Clara answered questions with patience and honesty, talking about the accident, about her recovery, about the process of learning to be comfortable in her own skin again. The children asked everything from the practical. Did it hurt? How many stitches did you get? To the profound, do you wish it never happened? Are you happy now? To that last question, Clara paused for a long time before answering. I wish my friend hadn't died. I wish the accident had never happened, but I can't change the past. All I can do is decide what to do with the present, and right now, I'm choosing to be happy. I'm choosing to be brave. I'm choosing to show up in my own life instead of hiding from it. She looked directly at Emma, who was beaming with pride. And I'm choosing to surround myself with people who see me, really see me, and decide I'm worth knowing anyway. That's what makes life beautiful. Not the absence of scars, but the presence of people who understand that scars are just proof we survived something hard. When the talk ended, the children surrounded Clara with more questions, with hugs, with drawings they'd made during her presentation. Emma stood beside her like a tiny bodyguard directing traffic, making sure everyone got a turn to talk to Clara without overwhelming her. Ben watched from the back of the classroom, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. This was what redemption looked like. Not grand gestures or dramatic transformations, but small moments of connection, of courage, of choosing again and again to show up even when showing up was hard. Mrs. Patterson, Emma's teacher, approached him with tears in her eyes. That was extraordinary. I've been teaching for 15 years and I've never seen children so engaged, so moved by a guest speaker. She gave them something precious. Permission to be imperfect, to be scared, to be brave anyway. She's pretty special, Ben agreed. So are you, Mrs. Patterson said. Emma talks about you constantly, about how you work hard to take care of her, about how you teach her to be kind, about how you showed everyone that courage matters by asking Clara to dance. She paused. You're giving these children a roadmap for how to be good humans. That matters more than you probably realize. After school, after Emma had given Clara a comprehensive tour of her classroom and shown her every single art project on the walls, the three of them went out for hot chocolate to celebrate. They sat in a booth at a diner that was warm and slightly worn, the kind of place where the waitresses knew everyone's name and the hot chocolate came with marshmallows without you having to ask. You were amazing, Ben told Clara. Those kids will remember that talk for the rest of their lives. I was terrified the entire time, Clara admitted. But also, it felt good, really good, like I was doing something that mattered. You were, Emma said seriously, chocolate on her upper lip. You were teaching us that it's okay to be different. That's important. Clara reached across the table and wiped the chocolate off Emma's face with a napkin. When did you get so wise? I've always been wise, Emma said matter-of-factly. Daddy says I was born wise. I just had to grow big enough for people to notice. They laughed, and the sound was warm and genuine, the kind of laughter that came from deep contentment rather than mere amusement. They sat in that diner booth for 2 hours, talking and laughing and just being together, and if anyone noticed Clara's scar, they didn't comment on it, and if anyone recognized them from the viral video, they didn't intrude, and the moment was perfect in its ordinary simplicity. That night, after Emma was in bed and the apartment was quiet, Ben received a text from Richard. Clara just called me crying. Happy crying. She said today was the first time since the accident that she felt like she was contributing something valuable to the world. Thank you for pushing her toward that opportunity. Ben texted back. She did that herself. I just stood next to her while she figured it out. That's what good friends do, Richard replied. Stand next to people while they figure things out. Speaking of which, the Foundation's holiday gala is next week. Clara wants to give a speech about the Harper Initiative and present you with an award. She didn't want to tell you herself because she was afraid you'd say no. Please don't say no. Ben stared at his phone, feeling the familiar anxiety that came with public attention. But underneath the anxiety was something else. A recognition that some moments required you to set aside your comfort for someone else's need. Clara needed this. Needed to publicly honor what he'd done for her, needed to complete the circle of giving and receiving that was at the heart of all genuine relationships. He texted back, I won't say no, but Emma's coming with me. We're a package deal. Wouldn't have it any other way. The night of the Foundation Gala arrived with a fresh snowfall that made the city look clean and magical, the kind of snow that belonged in movies rather than real life. Ben and Emma dressed in their best clothes, Ben in the suit Richard had insisted on buying him, Emma in a green velvet dress that made her look like a Christmas ornament come to life. They arrived at the hotel ballroom, and Ben felt a wave of déjà vu so strong it was almost physical. This was where it had all started, in this same room with these same chandeliers and this same polished marble floor. But everything was different now. He was different now. Clara met them at the entrance, stunning in a gown of deep burgundy, her hair swept up, her scar fully visible and unapologetic. She hugged Emma first, then Ben, and whispered, Thank you for coming. Thank you for letting me do this. Always, Ben said simply. The gala proceeded with the usual pattern of these events, cocktails and conversations, dinner and speeches, the carefully choreographed dance of high society philanthropy. But this time Ben wasn't serving drinks or collecting plates. He was seated at the head table next to Clara and Richard, with Emma between him and Clara, her legs swinging under the table as she ate her fancy dinner with exaggerated care. When it came time for Clara's speech, she stood and walked to the podium with her head high, and Ben felt a surge of pride so intense it brought tears to his eyes. This was the same woman who'd sat alone in a corner 6 weeks ago, drowning in isolation, and now she was commanding a room of 500 people with grace and confidence. 6 weeks ago, Clara began, and her voice carried clearly through the ballroom. I attended my father's charity gala and thought it would be the worst night of my life. I was wrong. It was the best night of my life because it was the night I learned that courage is contagious, that kindness matters, and that one person willing to see you can change everything. She told the story, the isolation, the cruelty, the moment Ben had crossed the ballroom floor to ask her to dance. The room was completely silent, everyone listening with the kind of attention usually reserved for life-changing news. What Ben did that night wasn't just kind, Claire continued. It was revolutionary. In a world that teaches us to look away from pain, he looked directly at it and said, You matter. In a world that values comfort over connection, he chose connection even when it was uncomfortable. In a world that had written me off as broken, he saw me as whole. She paused, visibly emotional. That moment sparked something bigger than either of us imagined. The video of our dance has been viewed over 30 million times now. The hashtag #DanceWithCourage has been used in 73 countries. We've received thousands of letters from people who saw that night and decided to be braver with their own struggles. Support groups have formed, hospital programs have been created, lives have been changed. Clara looked directly at Ben. And that's why tonight, the Thomas Lane Foundation is creating the Benjamin Harper Award for Extraordinary Compassion. This award will be given annually to someone who embodies what Ben showed us that night, that seeing people who need to be seen, that choosing courage over comfort, that standing with someone in their pain is the most important work any of us can do. She held up a crystal award that caught the light and threw rainbows across the ballroom. Ben Harper, would you please come accept the first award that will bear your name? Ben stood on legs that felt unsteady, Emma's hand clutching his as she walked with him to the podium. The entire ballroom rose in a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever, and Ben felt simultaneously honored and uncomfortable with the attention, grateful and overwhelmed by the recognition. When the applause finally died down, Clara handed him the award and stepped back to give him the podium. Ben looked out at 500 faces, all watching him expectantly, and felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. "I'm not good at speeches," he began, and there was a ripple of gentle laughter. "I'm better at doing than talking, but I'll try to say something that matters." He looked down at Emma, who was watching him with absolute confidence that he would say the right thing. 6 weeks ago, I was working 3 jobs and barely making rent. I was exhausted and lonely and convinced that life after trauma was just about survival, making it through each day without falling apart. And then I went to a gala where I was supposed to be invisible, where my job was to serve drinks and stay in the background. He paused, remembering that night with crystal clarity. But I saw Clara sitting alone, and I saw myself in her. I saw the same loneliness I'd been carrying, the same isolation, the same feeling that the world had decided you weren't worth seeing anymore. And I couldn't walk away from that. I couldn't be one more person who looked at someone in pain and decided it wasn't my problem. The room was completely silent now. Here's what I've learned since that night. Courage isn't about big gestures or heroic acts. It's about small choices. Choosing to see instead of looking away, choosing connection instead of comfort, choosing to show up even when showing up is hard. It's about deciding that other people's dignity matters more than your own convenience. He looked at Clara. I didn't save Clara. She saved herself. I just stood next to her while she did it, and that's all any of us can do for each other. Stand next to each other in the hard moments, witness each other's struggles, remind each other that we're not alone. Emma tugged on his hand, and when he looked down, she whispered loudly enough for the microphone to catch it. Tell them about Uncle Thomas. Ben smiled. My daughter's right. I need to tell you about Captain Thomas Lane. 15 years ago, he pulled me out of a burning vehicle in Kandahar. He saved my life at the cost of his own. And when he was dying, he told me to find his family, to tell them he was proud of them, to tell them the world needed brave people. Richard's face was wet with tears. I carried that message for 15 years, not knowing how to deliver it, not knowing if I'd ever find the right moment. And then I walked into this ballroom and saw Thomas's niece sitting alone, and I understood this was the moment. This was what Thomas had been preparing me for. Not just to survive, but to use my survival to help someone else survive. Ben held up the crystal award. This honor belongs to Thomas as much as to me. He's the one who taught me that courage matters, that one person can make a difference, that the real measure of a life isn't how much you accumulate, but how much you give. I'm just trying to live up to his example. He looked around the ballroom, at all the faces watching him, at the wealth and power and privilege gathered in this room. We all have a choice. We can look away from suffering, can tell ourselves it's not our problem, can stay comfortable in our own lives and let other people struggle in theirs. Or we can choose to see, can choose to connect, can choose to be the person who crosses the room, extends a hand and says, "You matter." His voice dropped, became more intimate. It doesn't take money or status or special skills. It just takes willingness. Willingness to be uncomfortable, to be vulnerable, to risk rejection or mockery or failure in service of doing the right thing. That's all I did that night. I chose to be willing, and everything else followed from that choice. Emma raised her hand, and when Ben nodded at her, she said into the microphone with perfect 9-year-old confidence, "What my daddy's trying to say is that being nice is more important than being rich or famous. And if everyone was nice like him and Clara, the world would be better." The laughter that followed was warm and genuine, and when Ben picked Emma up and held her while the room applauded again, he felt a completeness he'd never known was possible. This was family, not just blood relations, but chosen connections. People who decided to show up for each other, who'd chosen courage over comfort, who understood that healing was a collective project rather than an individual one. After the gala, after more conversations than Ben could count, and more photos than Emma could sit still for, the three of them found themselves alone in the ballroom again. The cleaning crew hadn't arrived yet, and the space was quiet except for the soft hum of the ventilation system and the distant sounds of the hotel's normal operations. "This is where it started," Clara said, standing in the middle of the dance floor. "6 weeks ago, right here, you asked me to dance and everything changed." "Everything changed for me, too," Ben said. "I just didn't realize it yet." Emma had found her way to the table where Petit Four were still laid out, and she was carefully selecting several to take home, completely oblivious to the emotional significance of the moment happening around her. Clara held out her hand to Ben. "Dance with me again? For real this time, without the pressure, without the cameras, without the whole world watching. Just us, just friends, just two people who figured out how to save each other." Ben took her hand and they moved together across the polished floor, with none of the nervousness of that first dance, with none of the weight of expectation or fear of judgment. This was just movement, just connection, just two people who'd been through fire and come out the other side changed, but whole. "Thank you," Clara said as they swayed to music only they could hear. "For everything, for seeing me, for standing with me, for teaching me that courage is possible." "Thank you," Ben replied, "for letting me, for showing me that life after trauma can be rich and meaningful, for giving Emma an example of what bravery looks like, for becoming family." They danced until Emma appeared between them, demanding to be included, and then it was three of them moving in an awkward circle, laughing at their own lack of coordination, not caring that they probably looked ridiculous, because sometimes ridiculous was exactly what healing looked like. Richard appeared in the ballroom doorway, watching them with an expression of such profound joy that it transformed his face. He pulled out his phone and took a photo, capturing this moment. His daughter dancing with the man his brother had saved. His daughter's smile genuine and bright. His found family being exactly what families should be, messy and imperfect and absolutely essential. Later, when Emma had finally exhausted herself and fallen asleep in the car, when they'd driven through the snowy city back to Ben's apartment, when Clara had been dropped off at her building with promises to have dinner again soon, Ben carried his daughter upstairs and tucked her into bed. She stirred briefly, murmured something about dancing and Petit Fours and how Clara was the best princess ever, then fell back into deep sleep. Ben stood in the doorway of her room, watching her breathe, thinking about how much had changed in 6 weeks. He'd gone from survival to living, from loneliness to connection, from just getting through each day to actually looking forward to what came next. He'd found purpose in running the foundation, had found family in Richard and Clara, had found proof that his service and his sacrifice and all the hard years hadn't been meaningless. He thought about Thomas Lane, about Helen Porter, about all the people whose courage had created pathways for others to follow. And he thought about how courage wasn't a finite resource that got used up. It was something that multiplied when shared, that grew stronger when witnessed, that became more possible the more people chose it. His phone buzzed with a text from Clara. "Tonight was perfect. Thank you for being exactly who you are." He texted back, "Thank you for becoming exactly who you were meant to be." Her response came quickly. "We did that together. That's what makes it matter." Ben looked at those words for a long time, then set his phone aside and let himself feel the full weight of gratitude for this strange, unexpected, absolutely essential life he'd somehow found. For Emma sleeping peacefully in the next room. For Clara learning to be brave. For Richard healing from 15 years of grief. For the foundation work that would let him help thousands of families who needed exactly what he'd needed when he came home from war. For all the people around the world who'd watched one dance and decided to be a little more courageous with their own struggles. For the support groups and hospital programs and conversations that had started because someone had chosen to see suffering instead of looking away. For the ripples that were still spreading, still growing, still changing lives in ways he'd never fully know or understand. Ben Harper stood in his small apartment in the city that had witnessed his struggle and his healing, and he thought about Helen Porter's words one more time. Survival, real survival, is the most beautiful dance of all. She'd been right. Survival wasn't just about making it through the fire. It was about what you did afterward, how you chose to live, who you chose to connect with, what you decided to build from the wreckage. It was about finding beauty in scars, strength in vulnerability, connection in shared suffering. It was about dancing even when you were scared, standing with people who needed standing with, choosing courage over comfort again and again until courage became habit. It was about being human in the fullest sense, flawed and frightened and brave anyway, scarred and surviving and reaching out anyway, broken and healing and building anyway. It was about recognizing that you weren't alone, that others were struggling too, that the greatest gift you could give was simply to see someone who needed seeing and say, "You matter." That every small act of kindness rippled outward in ways you'd never fully know, touching lives and changing stories, and making the world incrementally kinder, incrementally braver, incrementally more filled with grace. Ben turned off the lights and stood in the darkness of his apartment, listening to Emma's soft breathing, feeling the weight of the Crystal Award in his hands, thinking about tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that. He thought about courage and kindness and connection, about scars that proved survival, about families formed by choice rather than blood, about the way life sometimes surprised you with beauty when you'd stopped expecting it, about dancing with scarred girls in ballrooms, with his daughter in elementary school gymnasiums, with hope and fear and all the complicated emotions that made up a fully lived life. And he thought about how sometimes the most important thing you could do was simple. Show up. Be present. See people who needed seeing. Stand with them while they figured out how to stand on their own. Choose connection over comfort. Choose courage over convenience. Choose grace over the easy cruelty of looking away. That was the dance, the real one, the one that mattered. Not the performance in the ballroom that had been captured on video and shared around the world, but this, the daily choice to keep showing up, keep connecting, keep being brave even when brave was exhausting. The choice to survive not just with your body, but with your heart. To let your scars prove your strength instead of your weakness. To build something beautiful from broken pieces. To dance through the darkness until you found light again. Ben Harper set the Crystal Award on his bookshelf, next to the photograph of his wife and the crayon drawing Emma had made of him dancing with Clara. And he let himself believe what 6 weeks ago would have seemed impossible. That his best days weren't behind him, but ahead of him. That healing was possible. That courage mattered. That grace existed. That scars didn't make you less, but proved you'd survived something that tried to destroy you. That survival, real survival, was indeed the most beautiful dance of all. And that sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, the dance was only the beginning.